In 1939, Germany plunges Europe into war by breaking their promises for peace and marching into Poland. By the end of 1940, though, Britain is the only great power still standing against a seemingly invincible German juggernaut. On the surface, the war's opening phase seems like Hitler's crowning achievement. But did the first 16 months of World War II actually lay the groundwork for his ultimate defeat? The German invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, is usually considered the start of World War II, but it also started as a regional war between neighbors. The Polish Second Republic declared independence in 1918, and its western borders were established by the Treaty of Versailles, although violent clashes in some former German regions continued until 1921. Its eastern borders, though, were only made official after a bitter war against Soviet Russia, which also ended in 1921. But neither Germany nor the Soviet Union are satisfied with the new order. They both view the Polish state as an illegitimate creation of the Versailles system that they both resent, and both maintain claims on Polish territory. Even so, Warsaw signs non-aggression pacts with Moscow in 1932 and with Berlin in 1934. This fragile balance, however, masks the intentions of Poland's neighbors. German dictator Adolf Hitler has long viewed imperial expansion to the east as essential to gaining Lebensraum for the German people, and he and many other Germans want to recover the land ceded to Poland in 1919. Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin's intentions are the subject of some debate. Some historians argue that he wants to reconquer the lands of the Tsarist Empire, others that he wants to extend the Soviet border as far to the west as possible as a security buffer, or even that he's just looking to seize any territory at all if given the chance. Regardless, the Soviet regime views Poles as an enemy, and they particularly target ethnic Poles in the USSR during the Great Terror of 1937-38. In 1938, Nazi Germany annexes part of Czechoslovakia after the Munich Agreement, and the Polish government also takes a small piece of Czechoslovakia with German consent. Warsaw had considered war with the USSR the most likely threat, but after Munich, Germany sets its sights on Poland. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop insists on a solution to what he calls the German-Polish question, including German claims on the free city of Danzig, formerly part of Germany, but overseen by the League of Nations and administered by Poland. Berlin also accuses Warsaw of disrupting agreed German access to its exclave province of East Prussia, and local German Nazis in Danzig cause unrest. The semi-authoritarian Polish government, led by Prime Minister Felician Składkowski, looks to France and Britain for help, and both governments promise to support the Poles if Germany attacks. By summer 1939, war seems imminent to Polish military commander Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły. We want to exhaust all possible efforts for a peaceful solution to the Danzig question. But if Germany insists on its annexation plan, Poland will fight, even if alone and without allies. The entire nation, to the last man and woman, is ready to fight for Poland's independence. And if we say we're going to war because of Danzig, it is a fight for our independence. Hitler doesn't think that Britain and France will keep their word, but he doesn't want to risk a two-front war either. So the German government offers the Soviets a deal. Even though the Nazis and Soviets are bitter ideological enemies from the opposite sides of the political spectrum, they share a common goal of overturning the existing order in Europe and expanding their empires. On August 23, 1939, they shock the rest of Europe and sign a non-aggression pact, sometimes called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact after the two foreign ministers. In a secret protocol, they also agreed to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Germany can do as it likes in the former Czechoslovakia, Western Poland, and Lithuania, while the USSR has free reign in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Eastern Poland, and Bessarabia. The stage is set for war. In late August, the Germans stage 4 false flag incidents along the border to provide a pretext for invasion. Men of the SS Security Service under Reinhard Heydrich dress in Polish uniforms and raid a radio station at Gleiwitz, a customs post, a railway station, a gamekeeper's hut, and a few other targets. The Germans bring with them 4 men from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp and a local Polish sympathizer, whom they put in Polish uniforms, murder, and photograph as supposed evidence of failed Polish aggression. The fact that most of these false flag ops don't work as planned is overshadowed by the coming invasion. The German plan, Case White, calls for an attack from north and south. 2 German armies will close the Danzig corridor and move south from East Prussia towards Warsaw, and 3 southern armies will move north towards the Polish capital and east towards Lwów, today's Lviv. The German-aligned Slovak state allows German troops to use its territory. German armored and motorized divisions advancing with the support of the Luftwaffe will then trap Polish forces west of the Vistula. To carry out Case White, the Germans assemble 1.5 million men, 3,200 armored vehicles, and 2,000 planes. Most of their 2,000 tanks are smaller Panzer Is, IIs, or Czech models. Just 300 are modern Panzer IIIs or IVs. Of 50 divisions, 6 are armored and 4 motorized. The rest rely on horse-drawn transport. 3 Slovak divisions will also join. Opposing this force are about 1 million Poles in 38 infantry divisions, 1 motorized and 11 cavalry brigades. They have 1,100 armored vehicles, but nearly all are small or outdated models. They lack anti-tank weapons, and the air force is weak, with about 750 older models. At the urging of Britain and France, Poland delayed mobilizing for fear of provoking Germany, so by September 1st, only about half of Polish units are in their assigned defensive positions. The Polish plan is based on difficult choices, since their forces are weaker than the enemy. Concentrating their forces risks leaving valuable territory and resources unprotected, while defending the whole border means they'll be too thin to stop the enemy. Polish High Command decides to risk an all-round defense in the hope of resisting long enough for their French allies to launch their promised offensive 15 days after French mobilization. The morning of September 1st, Hitler falsely accuses the Polish army of firing onto German territory and announces that Germany is, quote, returning fire. German forces stream across the border, with the tank divisions aiming to break through and penetrate as far and as fast as possible to surround and isolate slower Polish forces into pockets. Aircraft like the Ju-87 Stuka ground attack planes hit Polish positions, logistics, and communications hubs to paralyze enemy command and control. Other German bombers hit Polish cities, not only for military purposes, but also to terrorize the civilian population. Some of the first shots of the war are fired by the German warship Schleswig-Holstein, which is supposed to be visiting Danzig on a friendship cruise, but instead supports the German assault on the peninsula of Westerplatte. The surprised garrison of 180 Polish troops resists furiously, but they're outnumbered and there's no hope of relief, so they surrender September 7th. Although the Germans quickly break through Polish lines in many places, many Polish units resist fiercely and hold up the German advance. A cavalry division holds up German tanks at Mokra, and at Krojanty, one action gives rise to a persistent myth of Polish cavalry senselessly charging German tanks. What really happens is that German tanks surprise a Polish unit of Ulan Lancers that is advancing to attack a German infantry unit, inflicting heavy casualties. An Italian war correspondent speaks to German tankers the next day, and his dramatized version of the story makes propaganda headlines across Germany, portraying German technological superiority and supposed Polish fanaticism. Other German war correspondents, like Kurt Frohwein, report a sanitized version from the front. This was the first Polish soldier I set eyes upon. A bloodied lump of human suffering, his legs drawn to his breast in pain, his face greenish and pale. We unbuttoned his blood-soaked tunic, and the German medic gave him a canteen of water. For the last time, a painful smile spread across his face as he whispered the German word, Danke. He died soon after, and now rests under a decorated wooden cross. Polish command and control could not keep up with the confusion behind the lines and rapidly changing situation at the front. On September 3rd, Polish Minister for War General Tadeusz Kasprzycki gave the order for the defense of Warsaw. The speed of the German advance shocks the Poles, and many Polish formations are trapped in pockets of varying sizes. These usually resist as long as they can, but shortages of food and ammunition and relentless air attack mean they can't hold out for long. As the Polish army prepares to defend the capital, on September 3rd, Britain and France declare war on Germany. Many Poles see this as their only chance for salvation, and citizens like Halina Regulska celebrate. We embraced each other, kissed, hugged, and danced. Long live England! Now we won't die in this unequal fight. A few hours later, France declared war on Germany. In Warsaw, there's enthusiasm and demonstrations. Still, the promised French offensive should only start in 2 weeks. In the meantime, the Germans take Krakow without a fight on September 6th. On the 8th, German spearheads reach the outskirts of Warsaw, though Polish troops prevent them from entering. A German report reflects their difficulties entering the capital. It was pointless to try to break through here. The brigade ordered a retreat. Slowly, with their turrets facing rearwards, the tanks pulled back, giving each other covering fire. Riflemen, some of whom had panicked and retreated too early, blocked their path. On the tanks' hulls lay dead and wounded. The order to retreat didn't reach many of the tanks, and they were left behind. On the 9th, Polish forces in a large pocket west of Warsaw launch a major counterattack at the Battle of the Bzura. They try to push the Germans back to break out and to prevent the encirclement of Warsaw. The fighting is the heaviest of the entire campaign, and although the Germans divert troops away from Warsaw and some Polish units do escape to the capital, German pressure on the ground and relentless air attack reduce the pocket in about a week. Around the same time, the Germans break the last Polish defenses in the north at Wiesna. Day by day, more Polish pockets surrender, and German forces surround Warsaw by September 15th. The Germans demand the city's unconditional surrender, but the Poles refuse. The Germans worry that the Poles might try to form a new line in the east between Brest-Litovsk and Lwów, but German forces reach Lwów first. Meanwhile, German planes relentlessly pound Polish cities, including the capital. On Grochów Boulevard, which was jammed with traffic, German fighters hunted from 100 meters up and fired with machine guns on refugees, military units streaming into Warsaw, and women on their way to pick potatoes in the fields. The corpses and horse carcasses lay in the street until evening, since another attack might start at any moment. With Warsaw surrounded and the Polish army in tatters, Poland's faint hopes rest on the promised French offensive. But instead of a full-scale attack on Germany's weakly defended Western Front, the French and British do little. The French make a limited advance for a few days, then withdraw to the Maginot Line. Instead, on September 17th, the Soviet Union joins the fighting on the German side. From the German point of view, Soviet entry can't come soon enough. They're so concerned about Britain and France that Berlin had been asking Moscow to join from the first days of September. Although Moscow allows the Germans to use naval facilities at Murmansk and radio stations for the Luftwaffe in Minsk, they need time to mobilize troops and end their border conflict with Japan in Mongolia. The Wehrmacht's quicker than expected advance, though, makes Stalin worry that his new partner might not respect their secret deal. The Soviets also want to avoid being seen as full aggressors, so they prepare pretexts in a note that Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov hands the Polish ambassador in Moscow. The Polish government has disintegrated and no longer shows any sign of life. This means that the Polish state and its government have, in point of fact, ceased to exist. The Soviet government also cannot view with indifference the fact that kindred Ukrainian and Belarusian people who live on Polish territory and who are at the mercy of fate should be left defenseless. The reality that the Polish government and army both still exist and are resisting the Germans makes little difference. Red Army orders urge the troops to aid the workers and peasants rebelling against their Polish landlords, but there is no such rebellion. 2 Red Army fronts with about 470,000 men, 4,000 tanks, 5,500 guns, and 2,000 aircraft cross the border. Facing them are 350,000 Polish troops, but many of them are unarmed reservists, and there's little in the way of heavy weapons. Many Poles are taken by complete surprise, and some, like Janusz Bardach, wonder whether the Red Army might in fact be coming to help them. 2 men shined flashlights in our eyes, while others surrounded us. I was astonished to see Soviet military uniforms and hear the Russian language. We were still a long way from the border. I couldn't imagine what Soviet soldiers were doing on Polish territory, and could only hope that the mighty Red Army had come to fight the Nazis and expel them from Poland. I wanted to express my joy at seeing them, but someone ordered us to put up our hands. Some locals, mostly Ukrainians, Belarusians and Jews, do welcome the Soviets in the hopes they'll be better treated than by the Polish authorities. Fighting is limited, though Polish troops fend off Soviet tanks at Grodno using Molotov cocktails and machine guns for 2 days. At Lviv, which is already besieged by the Wehrmacht but in the Soviet zone, German and Soviet commanders briefly consider a joint assault before the Germans withdraw. On September 22nd, in a show of cooperation, German and Soviet troops hold a joint parade in Brest-Litovsk, complete with victory arches decorated with swastikas and red stars. This was the same city where Soviet Russia and Germany had signed a peace treaty in 1918. The ceremony is observed by Generals Heinz Guderian and Semyon Krivoshein, who is Jewish, and they chat together in French. London and Paris are appalled by Soviet actions, but they don't feel they can risk war with the USSR on top of war with Germany. British Ambassador in Moscow, William Speeds, is blunt. I do not myself see what advantage war with the Soviet Union would be to us, though it would please me personally to declare it on Mr. Molotov. As the German and Soviet armies take control of most of Poland, in the occupied zones they quickly impose a reign of terror. Since the Soviets and Germans insist the Polish state does not exist, they consider Polish citizens under occupation to have no rights or protections. The Nazis consider Slavic Poles and Polish Jews, who make up 10% of the population, as subhumans who should be enslaved, killed, or driven away. SS Commander Reinhard Heydrich emphasizes that the first priority is to eliminate Polish elites. The people must be shot or hanged immediately without trial. The little people we want to spare, but the nobles, priests and Jews must be killed. But it wasn't just the SS that committed atrocities from the very start of the campaign in Poland. Some ethnic German civilians living in Poland formed militias and joined in the crime, and special Einsatzgruppen targeted Polish Jews and intellectuals for executions. In Przemyśl, for example, an Einsatzgruppe shoots 500 Jews in mid-September. Regular Wehrmacht units also killed Polish prisoners and civilians. Army commanders like Franz Halder will later say that the Nazi leadership is clear about the purpose of the war. It was the intention of the Führer and Göring to destroy and exterminate the Polish people. In the town of Częstochowa, 42nd Division troops massacre about 1,000 civilians, including 150 Jews, on the false pretext that civilians are firing on German troops. Helena Spielmann witnesses the killings. On the town square were gathered several thousand people, men, women and children. The whole square was surrounded by German soldiers who held their rifles at the ready. They thoroughly searched the Polish and Jewish men. If they found a razor blade, shaving knife or pocket knife, the man in question was brought to a nearby air raid trench and immediately shot. The Germans carry out similar massacres elsewhere on the pretext of mostly imaginary partisan action by civilians. In all, the Germans execute 12,000 to 15,000 Poles during the 5-week campaign, not including civilian victims of the aerial bombing. On October 4th, Hitler announces an amnesty for all Germans who've committed war crimes in Poland. The Soviets also commit crimes in their zone. They shoot or imprison Polish community leaders, officers, businessmen, wealthy farmers, landowners, and civil servants. Soviet authorities deport many to camps in the Soviet Union. They frequently shoot prisoners of war. After the brief battles of Grodno and Lviv, Soviet troops execute several hundred Polish defenders. During the campaign, some Poles turn violent against their ethnic German fellow citizens. In one incident at Bydgoszcz, enraged Poles killed 223 ethnic Germans, and the overall total might be as high as 6,000. As the Germans and Soviets impose their rule in occupied territory, Polish military resistance enters its final phase. In late September, there are only a few Polish pockets still holding out, at Modlin Fortress, Kotsk and Warsaw. The Polish government flees to neutral Romania and then to France. The Germans tried to capture Warsaw as soon as possible, but they've assigned too few units for the task and they're inexperienced in urban warfare. The 180,000-man Polish garrison is low on ammunition and heavy weapons, but they fight back using the urban landscape, ruins, and street barricades for cover. Elements of the 10th German Division are held up by a group of young Polish soldiers. About 30 military cadets, gunners, dug in a field gun and sat in a cellar next to it. If one of our tanks or assault guns appeared, a crew jumped up and fired until they were killed. Then came the next ones. This single gun demolished 3 German assault guns and 1 field gun. The Luftwaffe bombs the city heavily, targeting power stations, the water system, and electricity infrastructure. There is no power and no water. Civilian Halina Regulska recalled the scene. Above us raged an inferno. One plane after another dove down onto us, and every time it seemed to us that this time we'd be hit. This expectation of death made our hearts stand still. September 25th marks the biggest aerial bombing attack in history to that point, with 370 German planes dropping incendiary bombs to start fires. Overall, the bombing kills about 40,000 Warsaw residents. Warsaw Mayor Stefan Starzyński broadcast desperate radio appeals to Britain and France. And you, our allies, who promised to help and swore you would stand by us no matter what are you doing? That is what the dead and dying are asking. By September 26th, though, his tone changes. For the last time, I call on our allies. I am not asking for help. There's no time for that anymore. I demand revenge. For the churches reduced to ashes, for the tears and blood of the innocent dead, for the suffering of those torn apart by bombs, burned up by phosphorus shells, or suffocated in collapsed cellars and bunkers. May all broadcasters who hear us, especially the French, repeat to the entire world: Warsaw is fighting. Poland is not yet lost. But the siege of Warsaw soon ends. Water shortages, the risk of disease, and the hopeless military situation forced the Poles to surrender on September 28th. Soon after, Modlin Fortress also gives up, though the pocket at Kotsk holds out until October 6th, marking the end of organized Polish resistance. The Germans hold a victory parade in Warsaw, filmed by well-known director Leni Riefenstahl. The remnants of the Polish army try to escape to neutral neighbors, and between 80 and 200,000 men succeed. On the way, some units, like that of Captain Romuald Galicki, run into armed opposition from unfriendly civilians in an echo of the inter-ethnic fighting of 20 years before. We march at night. There is no contact with the enemy. On the way, Ukrainian bands in villages Stepan, Maniewice, and Ratno were liquidated. The Polish campaign is over, and Nazi Germany and the USSR achieve their immediate goals. Stalin will soon say their friendship is, quote, sealed in blood. They also agree to modify their zones of control. Germany gets more of Poland and more Soviet raw materials needed for the war with France and Britain, while the Soviet Union can now include Lithuania in its sphere of influence. Moscow soon offers Vilnius to Lithuania, which accepts. The Germans also give a small piece of Polish territory to the Slovak state. The speed and destruction of the German victory is exploited by Nazi propagandists to create the image of an all-powerful Wehrmacht, and contributes to the myth of Blitzkrieg as a deliberate doctrine. In reality, the German High Command feels the army had been rushed into war by the political leadership before it was ready, and judges its performance and munition stocks to be insufficient for war with Britain and France. The German military suffers about 15,000 dead, 30,000 wounded, and 3,400 missing. They also lose 217 tanks, nearly 10% of those deployed. The Red Army loses about 750 dead and 1,800 wounded. Polish losses are much higher. In the military, between 70 and 120,000 dead, 130,000 wounded, and 700,000 prisoners taken by the Germans, and 220,000 prisoners taken by the Soviets. Between 1 and 200,000 Polish civilians are killed. As much as Poland's people have suffered during the dual invasion, the horrors of the occupation, both on the German and Soviet side, will soon bring much worse. But Soviet dreams of territorial expansion don't end with Poland. As the Polish operation comes to an end, Soviet forces gather for another offensive into the rugged, wintry frontier with Finland. November 1939. Germany and the Soviet Union have conquered Poland, and Germany is at war with France and Britain. Moscow is free to do as it pleases in Eastern Europe and sets its sights on Finland, but the Winter War will be a nasty surprise for Stalin. In August 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany sign what they call a non-aggression pact. It includes a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence where each power can act as it sees fit. As planned, they invade Poland together in September, and while Germany turns west, in October the Soviet Union forces the governments of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to allow Red Army bases on their territory. Moscow's next target is Finland, formerly a part of the Russian Empire. But the resulting Winter War, or Finnish campaign as the Soviets call it, will be far longer and bloodier than Moscow expects. Finnish-Soviet relations have been rocky since Finland declared independence from Russia in 1917. Both countries suffered devastating civil wars after World War I, but while the communist Bolsheviks win in Russia, the anti-communists win in Finland, despite a younger Joseph Stalin's efforts to help the Reds. Some Finns briefly consider trying to acquire the border region of Eastern Karelia, where the culture and people are similar, but a 1920 treaty agrees on the pre-1917 border, though Finland gains the Arctic port of Petsamo. Moscow, though, still regards Finland as hostile to the revolution, and Helsinki fears the Soviets' territorial and ideological intent. In the 1930s, despite a non-aggression pact between the two countries, the Soviets repress ethnic Finns in Eastern Karelia, who had briefly rebelled in the 1920s, and kill many Finnish communists who fled to the USSR after they lost the Civil War. Most historians agree that Stalin wants to reclaim as much as possible of the former Russian Empire and annex Finland, as he does to Eastern Poland and will later do in the Baltics and Bessarabia. Stalin does worry that the Gulf of Finland and the Baltics are a possible springboard for capitalist powers to threaten the USSR, especially Leningrad, though whether this security fear outweighs his desire for conquest is debated. Stalin and his foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, present the Finns with their security demands. They tell Helsinki to allow Soviet bases on its territory, especially on the strategic Hanko Peninsula, to give up territory on the Karelian Isthmus, plus islands in the Gulf of Finland and part of the Rybachi Peninsula, and to destroy their border fortifications. In exchange, Finland would receive twice as much mostly uninhabited land in Eastern Karelia. The Finnish government under President Kyösti Kallio discussed the Soviet demands. Military commander Karl Mannerheim wants to compromise, while Foreign Minister Elias Erkko doesn't, in case this leads to further Soviet demands. Losing Hanko and the Karelian forts would also make Finland more vulnerable to an eventual attack by the more powerful Red Army, even though most Finns still think Stalin is bluffing. France and Britain, who are at war with Germany but also oppose Soviet aggression, recommend that the Finns reject the Soviet proposals, since in their view, a Soviet attack is unlikely. Germany tells the Finns to give in, but the Finns don't trust the Germans because of the Nazi-Soviet pact. In the end, talks are broken off with no agreement, though it's unlikely Stalin would be satisfied in the long term, even if Finland had accepted. The Finns hope for support from their Scandinavian neighbours, other great powers, and the League of Nations will deter Soviet invasion. They also believe that if the Red Army does attack, it will take time for it to prepare. The Soviets expect a campaign against Finland will be as quick as that in Poland, and Red Army Chief Commissar Lev Mechlis believes Finnish workers and peasants will greet the Soviets as liberators. Moscow considers the Finnish army as weak and outdated and writes off foreign support. Who would help Finland? The Swedes? The British? The Americans? There's no way in hell. There'll be a fuss in the press, moral support, moaning and whining. But troops, aircraft, cannons and machine guns? No. As both sides prepare for war, the Red Army falsely claims the Finns shelled one of its positions on November 26th, and Moscow rejects Helsinki's offer of an international investigation. On November 30th, 1939, Soviet aircraft bomb the Finnish capital, and the Winter War begins. Militarily, the struggle seems one-sided. The Finnish army is small, as their initial mobilized force is just 250,000 with 500 guns. They're short on artillery, shells, communications equipment, anti-tank guns, and have just 30 tanks. The Air Force has just 114 planes. Meanwhile, the Red Army is undergoing a planned expansion up to 4.5 million men. 425,000 will march on Finland, supported by 2,500 tanks, 2,800 guns, and over 2,000 aircraft. On the other hand, most Finnish unit commanders served in the Tsarist or German armies in World War I or in the Finnish Civil War, and the rank and file are well trained. The reserve units know the terrain well, and most are skilled in outdoor survival and marksmanship. The Finnish army is backed up by the Civil Guard and the Lotta Sverd, whose all-female personnel served as nurses, in auxiliary functions, and in munitions production. Morale is solid. We are so few, and they are so many. Where will we find the room to bury them all? The Soviet officer corps is weakened after Stalin's executions, training is poor, especially for winter fighting and ski-borne units, and the armor, infantry and artillery and air power don't know how to work together. The Red Army also doesn't have enough medical units, radios or winter gear. Morale is also low, as a platoon commander notes in his diary. The troops' political awareness and morale is weakening. They say that supposedly the Soviet government has always said we do not want an inch of someone else's land, and now we've started a war with Finland. If we explain that it is necessary to strengthen the borders, they will object that no one attacked us. I myself believe the contradictions with Finland could have been resolved. Red Army Front Commander Kirill Meretskov draws up the Soviet battle plan. He envisions a massive assault against the Finnish Mannerheim line on the Karelian Isthmus, to push towards the major Finnish cities. Further north, the Soviets hope to drive north of Lake Ladoga and also towards the town of Oulu to cut the country in two at its narrowest point. Supporting attacks include a strike at the Arctic port of Petsamo. He expects his troops to achieve victory by Stalin's birthday on December 21st. Some Soviet commanders worry that the plan underestimates the terrain and the enemy, but the High Command ignores them. Soviet authorities also deport ethnic Finns living on their side of the border to the interior. The Finns have been preparing for a Soviet invasion since the 1920s. Their Mannerheim line makes use of the swamps, streams and lakes on the isthmus in the hope of stopping Soviet thrusts towards the Finnish interior, but their plan is purely defensive. The Soviets also set up a puppet communist government in waiting under Otto Ville Kuusinen, even though he has little popular support. Moscow now refuses to deal with the legitimate Finnish government, only with its own puppet. This causes most Finns, even those who supported opposite sides in the Civil War, to see the war as one of national survival rather than over territory. Radical leftist Olavi Sipainen rallies to the cause. Now it wasn't a question of whether we were communists or fascists. The political walls within Finland that we had built and done our utmost to uphold crumbled. Then was the moment, a morning that will never cease to radiate its light on us who experienced it. At the front, Red Army units cross the border and reach the Mannerheim line along the Taipale River, where they run into trouble. From December 6th, the Red Army repeatedly tries to break through Finnish defenses, but Soviet infantry and tanks hold tight formations, making them easy targets. The marshy terrain in the area slows the Soviets down, and Finnish artillery and infantry inflict heavy losses. The Soviets have stumbled into a pre-planned killing zone. The guns fire a mixture of shrapnel against the infantry and high explosive to disable armor, usually breaking up an assaulting force within 5 or 6 minutes. The Finnish positions make the most of the terrain and river, and their heavy weapons are well camouflaged. The tanks, though, are a particular challenge for the Finns, who use cluster grenades, satchel charges, and even pry off tracks with crowbars. They also use bottles of flammable alcohol with cloth fuses, known as Molotov cocktails. Finnish soldier Karlo Erho recalls a comrade's lone action against a Soviet tank. He calmly lit the fuse and threw the bottle toward the last tank. It hit just behind the air intake slots and immediately caught fire, reflecting the surrounding area with its yellowish flame. Soon the entire tank was enveloped in fire, and Kivivirta said, broiled Russians for sure. Soviet attacks in the area peter out by December 27th. Their attempts to break the line around Kolla also fail. This is the area where famous Finnish sniper Simo Häyhä is most active. He's later given the nickname the White Death, though he's known in Finland at the time as the Magical Marksman. He claims 500 kills, which would make him the most successful known sniper in history. An even more dangerous White Death for Red Army soldiers is the winter. In December, temperatures drop to as low as -40 degrees, and since their winter gear and logistics capabilities are severely lacking, the Soviets suffer terribly from cold and hunger. Thousands simply freeze to death at their positions. The conditions and weapons supply problems also take their toll on Finns like Vesteri Lepisto. There was always a lack of ammunition. Our hand grenades, produced in 7 different countries, were really hazardous. Our lives were at stake every time we used them. Our most aggravating work was getting out there in 40 below zero, right in front of the enemy lines, to set up barbed wire barricades. We had to work without gloves, and we dared not make any noise. Everything was done at night. So the Finns have stopped the Red Army on the Mannerheim line, where a stalemate sets in. Elsewhere, though, there's plenty of movement. Near Lake Tolvajärvi, Finnish units counterattack on December 12th. The many frozen lakes, thick fog, and broken ground make it hard for the Soviets to use their air power and tanks effectively. The Red Army had nearly cut off the defenders when it arrived a few days before, and now its cold and hungry soldiers are enjoying sausage stew from captured Finnish field kitchens. A scratch force of Finnish staff officers and other non-combat personnel attacks them at night, inflicts heavy casualties, and stops the Soviet drive. They also capture Soviet artillery, machine guns, and T-26 tanks. The so-called Sausage War is the first Finnish offensive victory of the war, and they suffer 350 casualties while inflicting up to 5,000. In central Finland, the Soviet 9th Army's 50,000 troops far outnumber the 11,000 Finnish defenders, but it's inexperienced and poorly trained. It has very few skis and very few men who can ski, so it advances in long, vulnerable columns along the few forested roads towards the town of Suomussalmi, which it takes on December 7th. That day, Finnish writer Ylmari Kihanto writes in his diary, "The evening was extremely beautiful in the village of Suomussalmi when the Russians attacked it. White snowy fields were twinkling, stars in the sky were glimmering, the northern lights were calmly shimmering. Then some kind of indistinct hum, and then the roar of military guns, the flame rising to the height of the fire and reflected as if in a magic mirror of eternity. Why did this happen? Why did the Finns have to defend their country with blood? And what servant of the devil sent the Russians here, who were probably peace-loving people, sent them to destroy our homeland?" Soviet units then move west, but they overextend themselves. A mixed Finnish force of regular troops, border police, and civil guards counterattack and cut the vital Røste road to stop Soviet forces from joining up. Over the next several weeks, the Finns will apply what will become known as Motti tactics to this and other columns. Motti is a block of firewood, and the Finns plan to cut the Soviet column into similar isolated blocks so they can destroy them one at a time despite their inferior numbers. Finnish units move quickly through the thick forests and snipe or ambush at will. The forests hamper Soviet firepower, and the confusion and poor road network mean the Red Army can barely move up enough rations and ammunition. Soviet troops caught along the road are confused, starving, and freezing, and they never know when or from what direction the next ambush will come. Groups of Red Army soldiers try to flee through the woods, but the Finns cut them down or make them prisoner. Some Mottis give up without any combat, as they cannot move and have no shelter or food. The remnants of the Soviet 44th Division try to break out, but the Finns wipe them out by January 8th. The Soviet commander escapes to friendly lines, though his superiors have him executed later. The Battle of Suomussalmi is a clear Finnish victory. They stop the Soviet advance in central Finland, inflict about 25,000 casualties while only suffering 2,700, and destroy 43 tanks, 260 trucks, along with other valuable equipment and weaponry. Meanwhile, in the far north, the few Finnish forces available fight hard but cannot stop the Red Army from taking Petsamo on December 2nd. The Soviet invasion has ground to a halt, and Stalin acknowledges the situation. The war in Finland is a serious war, sharply different from our autumn campaign in Poland. Diplomatic activity, though, continues. The League of Nations expels the Soviet Union at the start of the war, which puts pressure on Stalin. He's losing prestige, and he's internationally isolated. Meanwhile, the Red Air Force continues to pound Finnish cities, especially Viipuri, which they hit with 12,000 bombs. The Red Army adapts. Critics of the original plan, like Boris Shaposhnikov and Semyon Timoshenko, take charge of the war. Timoshenko is responsible for breaking the Mannerheim line, but for now, he stops frontal assaults and orders his forces retrained in combined arms operations. Reinforcements bring troop numbers up to 600,000, along with more tanks and guns to replace losses. The Finns do not have any more reserves, though they have gotten some help from abroad. About 12,000 foreign volunteers joined the Finnish cause, mostly from Sweden, but also from the US, Britain, Norway, Estonia, Hungary, Italy, and other countries. Notable names include future Norwegian resistance leader Max Manus and British actor Christopher Lee. French, British, Americans, Italians, and Swedes also send some aircraft, weapons, and non-lethal aid, with Sweden contributing a unit of Gloucester Gladiators and anti-aircraft artillery. However, neither the volunteers nor the military aid is enough to equalize the situation on the battlefield. On February 1st, the Soviets try the Mannerheim line again with more firepower. This time, they focus more on the Viipuri Gateway, a heavily defended gap in the lakes and marshes around the town of Summa. Soviet guns fire over 300,000 shells the day before the assault, and Red Army troops also stormed the entire length of the line to prevent Finns from reinforcing the gateway. After 10 days of vicious fighting, with many positions changing hands several times, the Soviets break through and send their armor through the gateway. Soviet artillery officer Nikolai Voronov recalls the combined arms' success. A hurricane of our bombs and shells descended on Summa. I was at a forward observation post. After the artillery had shifted its fire to the required depth, infantry and tanks simultaneously attacked and began to advance successfully. This time, the enemy did not hold out. His flanks were in danger of encirclement, and he began to retreat. The strong point fell before my eyes. The Finns fall back to the interim line of defense, but the Red Army crosses it by February 28th. And although fierce Finnish resistance continues, including on other sectors of the front where there are still mottiing Soviet columns, they cannot stop the Red Army drive towards Viipuri and Helsinki. Meanwhile, in February and early March, some British and French politicians argue they should intervene to help the Finns, potentially alongside Norwegian and Swedish troops, since they view the Soviets as an ally of Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill praises Finnish resistance as sublime and superb, and French Premier Édouard Daladier mentions the overly optimistic number of 50,000 troops. London and Paris do discuss the possibility of sending ground troops into Finland, a naval attack on Soviet ports, or attacking Soviet oil production in the Caucasus or Crimea, perhaps sparking a Ukrainian revolt. But they mistakenly expect Finland can hold out until May. The Allies, though, are already at war, and even supporters like French socialist politician Alexandre Varenne have doubts. We are at war with Germany, which remains our principal concern. If we are to be brought to also fight against the immense Soviet Empire, we'd have to be given a reason to do so, and it would have to be compelling. Norway and Sweden also refuse to let Allied troops pass through their territory in response to German threats. Still, Stalin is afraid of possible Allied military intervention and wants to end the conflict as soon as possible, so talks with Finland begin on March 6th. At the front, Finnish troops put up a bitter fight on the approaches to Viipuri, but the Soviets forced them back and threatened to take the city. Finnish General Heinrichs admits that the situation is lost. It is my duty to report that the present state of the army is such that continued military operations can lead to nothing but further debilitation and fresh losses of territory. On March 12, 1940, Finland and the USSR signed the Treaty of Moscow, and the Winter War is over. Finland gives up 10% of its territory, mostly in the southeast and far north. 420,000 Finns flee the annexed regions. It must also lease the Hanko Peninsula to the Soviets for 50 years for them to use as a naval base. The Winter War has been short but bloody. About 25,000 Finnish troops are killed and 43,000 wounded, while the Soviets lose about 126,000 dead and 264,000 wounded. The Finnish Air Force and anti-aircraft guns take down 579 Soviet planes while losing just 53 of their own. Soviet bombing raids kill and wound about 900 Finnish civilians. Finnish resistance, and partly the danger of Allied intervention, convinced Stalin to back off from his initial goal of full control and regime change in Finland. But even limited success makes the Soviets more confident. Defeating the Finns is not a great task. The main thing on our victory is that we defeated the technique, tactics, and strategy of the great European states, who were the teachers of the Finns. That is our main victory. In Germany, the war strengthens Adolf Hitler's desire to attack the USSR. He sees it as proof that Stalin's Great Terror fatally weakened the Red Army and that the Soviet Union is unprepared for war. Finland has preserved its independence but experiences a national trauma. The suffering of the Finnish population under Soviet bombing and the ethnic cleansing of the annexed regions leads to lasting bitterness. One Soviet soldier remarks, "The Finns are not mean. They just really hold a grudge. They remember who's done them harm in the past. God forgives. The Finns do not." Less than a year later, the two countries will be at war again. While war rages in Poland and Finland, the Western Front is very quiet. This allows Germany to concentrate in the east, and for the Allies, it could be a decisive or a lost opportunity. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, setting off the Second World War. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war on Germany. As the German army races towards Warsaw, many German generals are worried the French might simply walk into Western Germany, and there's not much the Wehrmacht can do about it if they do. But instead of a powerful Allied counteroffensive, the French and British mostly sit back and wait during the so-called Phoney War. So why didn't the Allies attack Germany in 1939? While German infantry, cavalry, and tanks cut deep into Polish territory, Britain and France send Hitler an ultimatum: withdraw your troops or face war. Berlin ignores it, so London and Paris declare war on September 3rd, and the German-Polish War has become the Second World War. Hitler, though, is taken by surprise. He did not expect Britain and France to enter the war, and now the bulk of his army is engaged in Poland, leaving Germany's western border exposed. Interpreter Paul Schmidt records the scene after he translates London's declaration of war for Hitler. "After I finished, there was total silence. Hitler sat there as if petrified and stared straight ahead. After a while, which seemed like an eternity for me, he turned to Ribbentrop, who kept standing at the window as if frozen. What now? Göring turned to me and said, 'If we lose this war, may heaven have mercy on us.'" Even though Hitler soon regains his confidence, in principle the Nazi leadership has good reason to worry. The British and French empires combined have more troops, aircraft, warships, manpower reserves, natural resources, and industrial base than Germany. Just 11 German divisions guard its western frontier, behind an unfinished line of fortifications known as the Westwall, or Siegfried Line in English. All of the German armor and most of the air force are in Poland. The French army, on the other hand, has begun to mobilize 4.5 million men, and it has more than 2,000 tanks and 10,000 guns available. Even without the British Expeditionary Force, which begins to arrive within days, French forces dwarf their new enemies on the Franco-German border. German General Siegfried Westphal estimates that if the French launch a full-scale offensive, German forces in the west could only hold out for 2 weeks, a warning that must trouble the Germans when the French do cross the border on September 7, 1939, in the nearly forgotten Saar Offensive. As part of France's alliance with Poland, Paris agrees to launch an attack in the west within 2 weeks of mobilization. Given the speed of the German advance in Poland, French Commander-in-Chief General Maurice Gamelin starts the operation early, and units of the 3rd and 4th French armies move into Germany. They take the heavily mined Vannes forest and capture several villages within the first days, but overall, the French penetrate no more than 8 kilometers on a 25-kilometer front. There's relatively little fighting, as a French soldier reports. "We have not suffered many casualties so far. Most were caused by mines in German territory. Example, a soldier picks up the képi of a Hun officer, a mine explodes. He picks up an apple, a mine explodes. A hare lies dead on the ground. He drags it, a mine explodes. The most dangerous mines have a fuse which delays the explosion. They are buried in the villages we occupy." French forces, though, stop short of the Westwall on orders from the High Command, and a month of occasional pot shots and skirmishes follows. Gamelin views the offensive as having fulfilled France's pledge to Poland, and feels Poland is lost in any case. In October, the French learn the Germans are transferring divisions to the west, so they withdraw to the Maginot Line by mid-October. The short-lived Saar offensive is the only ground operation of what will become known as the Phoney War, Drôle de Guerre, or Sitzkrieg. It cost the French about 1,500 casualties and the Germans about 500. After the war, German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel admits Allied inaction takes many Germans by surprise. "We were astonished to find only minor skirmishes undertaken between the Siegfried and Maginot lines. We did not understand why France did not seize this unique opportunity, and this confirmed us in the idea that the Western powers did not desire war against us." So why did the British and French not invade Germany when its western border is nearly undefended? One reason the Allies don't act is that their war strategy is focused on a long war of attrition, not a fast-moving, decisive war of movement in the field. The British and French know that in the longer term, they have advantages over Germany, just as they did in the First World War. They feel they need to take time to fully mobilize their forces and industry to be ready for the conflict that they expect to take at least 5 years to win. France especially wants time to buy more aircraft from the United States to strengthen its weak air force, and Britain will take time to build up a full-strength army to fight alongside them. By the end of September, there are only 150,000 British troops in France, far too few to share the load. The Allies also implement a blockade of Germany from September 4th, part of their plan for a longer war, but they greatly underestimate the impact of Soviet raw materials for Germany's war effort. Allied planners expect that their militaries and economies will be ready to go on a carefully planned offensive by 1941 or 42. In any case, they accept Poland will be occupied by Germany and plan to restore Poland after their eventual victory. British diplomat Alexander Cadogan puts the case bluntly and prophetically in mid-September 1939. "We must lose the war for 4 years before we win a decisive battle." A key part of this strategy is their belief in the superiority of the defense, another lesson they take from the First World War. If Germany attacks first, the French will be able to fight from the advantageous position of their Maginot Line of extensive and powerful fortifications along the border. A defensive strategy, Paris hopes, will save precious French lives. France suffered worse than Britain or Germany in the First World War, and its low birth rate means it has far fewer men of military age than Germany or Britain, and its population is the same as in 1914. This concern gives all the more reason for the French to wait until the British have raised a large enough army to help carry more of the load. French leaders also want to avoid France becoming the main battlefield as it had been in the First World War, which makes Belgium a key part of Allied strategy. The Allies want to meet an eventual German attack in Belgium, but the Belgians refuse to cooperate in any war plans because of their strict neutrality. This is a key weakness in Allied strategy, as France would be exposed if the Germans moved through Belgium as in 1914. The Franco-Belgian border is not covered by the Maginot Line either, because it would have been too expensive, and partly because the water table is too shallow for deeper fortifications. Belgium's adherence to strict neutrality means that France is more vulnerable, and it makes even less sense for them to venture into an offensive into Germany. Many Allied leaders, including General Gamelin, are frustrated by the Belgian position. The Belgians are unthinking, short-sighted mediocrities, in large part to blame for Poland's obliteration. They have considerably handicapped Franco-British action when they could have helped in numerous ways. Belgium must bear a heavy responsibility, and she will pay for it by serving as the power's battlefield. French planners are instead drawn to other strategies that might take the war elsewhere. There's talk, for example, of a plan to bomb Soviet oil facilities at Baku and stop oil shipments on the Caspian and Black Seas to deprive the German army of oil and bring about a less bloody strategic success. Allied leaders also discussed plans to drop mines into the Rhine River to disrupt German shipping, or potential interventions in the Balkans or Norway. First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, even suggests a naval incursion into the Baltic, which would likely result in heavy losses to the Royal Navy, given the lethality of air power against warships is not yet fully understood. But these or any bold move in the West require political capital, and that is in short supply in France. French politics are bitterly divided between the far right and far left, between those committed to the war effort and those who aren't, and bitter personal rivalries. There are even some who say France should not take a risk at the front in case Britain abandons her and makes a separate peace with Germany. Military leadership is also lacking, as Allied command structures are overly complicated and Gamelin is not a decisive commander. Charles de Gaulle compares him to a scientist experimenting calmly in a lab. In high-level meetings in mid-September, the Allies confirmed their choice for a long-term attritional strategy based on the defensive. This makes more sense, in their view, given the way they think about the type of fighting that they expect in 1941 or 1942. The Maginot Line lies at the heart of French military doctrine. Built between 1929 and 1937, its system of deep, well-armed and well-positioned fortifications stretches along the Franco-German border. The larger forts have multiple batteries of guns hidden in turrets and fully functional facilities for garrison life, including electric generators and narrow-gauge rail systems for supply and ammunition transport. It's state-of-the-art and costs the French state so much money they have to cut from other parts of the military in order to build it. The line fits with the French army's doctrine, based on its winning formula from the First World War. Reliance on mass use of artillery in a long war of attrition where the defender has the tactical and operational advantage. Given the French and British empires, with access to American production and finance, are stronger than Germany, this approach makes sense to Allied leaders fearful of the cost of all-out offensives. As General Henri Pétain put it, France's approach to wars was, quote, lavish with steel, stingy with blood. The French have a more modern army than in 1918, with more and better tanks, partial motorization, fewer cavalry, and modern air power, but their doctrine is still based on 1918. The tanks, which are arguably no worse than their German counterparts, and of which the Allies have more than the Germans, are meant to support the infantry and advance under the protection of the artillery. The French Air Force is also built to deny French airspace to the Germans more than carrying out an offensive air war. The Armée de l'Air only has about 100 bombers at the start of the war. It's a centralized, controlled, and limited approach to fighting a war of matériel that does not lend itself to the dilemma of September 1939, when to strike at Germany would mean taking the initiative with limited means. Such thinking has framed French thought for years, as War Minister General Louis Morin reveals in 1935. Why, having built our fortifications of the Maginot Line, would we leave them to embark on who knows what adventure? Another factor in this thinking is that Allied analysts mistakenly assess that Germany, which has been rearming for longer than they have, has reached its economic peak for war mobilization and is more ready for war than they are. French thinking about the primacy of the defensive and the value of their own fortifications means they won't consider turning that doctrine on its head in 1939, especially when Germany has its own defensive line they would have to overcome in the Westwall. The Siegfried Line, though, is unfinished and far weaker than the French imagine, but their faith in the Maginot Line increases their perception of the danger of attacking the Westwall. Even the better equipped and motorized BEF adopts a defensive stance as well. When British units begin to arrive in France in September 1939, they start building their own line of bunkers and pillboxes, known as the Gort Line after BEF commander Lord Gort. So Allied strategy, doctrine, and politics lie behind the failure to invade Germany in fall 1939. After Poland is defeated by German and Soviet forces in October, the Phoney War in the West remains in limbo. Both sides try to take advantage of the lull by preparing for the spring campaign. Fighting is limited to artillery duels or skirmishes, which, while rare, are still terrifying for those under fire. While we were cutting trees in the forest near the first line, we were bombarded by the Germans. I do not know how I was saved. There is no doubt that our Lord intervened. One of my pals, lying 1.50 meters from me, was cut in two and died without a sound. Another, even closer, had his ribs broken and his belly opened by shrapnel. Today, while writing this letter 6 days after this event, I still cry when thinking about this horrible carnage and the horrifying screams. At some points along the Rhine River, French and Germans simply observe the comings and goings of the other side, which include German propaganda broadcasts via loudspeakers that try to stoke anti-British feelings among the French. On the British home front, German fortifications play a central role in the popular morale-boosting song "We're Going to Hang Out the Washing on the Siegfried Line." Contrary to pre-war expectations, though, neither side wages a mass strategic bombing campaign. Both the British and the French fear that the bombing of cities will result in mass death and destruction, and the French especially lack air defenses and radar. Pre-war British estimates predicted the Luftwaffe could drop 3,500 tons of bombs on London on the very first day of the war, and that 600,000 Britons might be killed in the first 6 months, on the principle that the bomber will always get through. These predictions for a knockout blow don't come true, because neither side has enough heavy bombers or a feasible plan for strategic bombing. The Germans don't plan a strategic bombing campaign at this stage of the war, and the Allies fear retaliation if they start one. So both sides limit their air activity mostly to the dropping of propaganda leaflets, reconnaissance flights, and limited bombing raids against military or naval targets away from major cities and town. A far cry from the devastating bombing of Polish cities by the Luftwaffe. The French improve their army's organization and equipment during the quiet months, but the lack of action and long, cold winter take a toll on morale and discipline. The months of inactivity during an especially cold winter eat away at French readiness for action, even though French society generally accepts the reasons for going to war. Morale and discipline suffer. Alcohol abuse, water quality issues, disease, poor housing, and poor food all contribute. Suicides account for 3.8% of French military deaths. Many men also resent wealthier or privileged Frenchmen who avoid military service, and some suspect that Britain dragged France into the war. While many French troops spend the winter in uncomfortable barracks or bunkers, conditions in the Maginot Line are often good. Still, the men find spending most of their days underground saps their morale, like this soldier in December. "I can assure you that I have had enough of this underground life. I've been here since 23rd August, and it's more than enough because, as you know, there is no distraction, and we're only allowed 1 hour to breathe outside." The Phoney War also affects the relationship between the home front and the troops, like French serviceman Jean-Paul Sartre and his partner Simon de Beauvoir, whom he nicknames Castor. A ghost war, a Kafkaesque war. I cannot feel it, it is fleeing me. Military dispatches say nothing of our losses. Wounded men are nowhere to be seen. The Germans are not on our soil, no bombardment of the rear. Castor is at war, not me. I imagine that this feeling is common to many. When I left Castor on 2nd September, I was ready for more and for better than this quiet mediocrity. Now I am infected, rotten. Some British officers take a dim view of their allies and suspect that the French army might be unreliable. General Alan Brooke reacts to a French march past in November. Men unshaven, horses ungroomed, clothes and saddlery that did not fit, vehicles dirty, and complete lack of pride in themselves and their units. What shook me the most, however, was the look in the men's faces, disgruntled and insubordinate looks. Although ordered to give the eyes left, hardly a man bothered to do so. Behind the lines, the Germans and the Allies planned for major operations in 1940. In November, the Allies confirmed the Daley-Breda plan, which will see British and French forces move into Belgium and the Netherlands if Germany attacks them. It's a plan that can't be prepared in advance, since the Dutch and Belgians refuse to work with the Allies to maintain their neutrality. If the Germans invade, things will have to be worked out on the spot. Hitler initially wants to attack in the West as early as November 1939, but numerous delays and opposition from his generals put off Case Yellow until the spring. He very nearly never gets the chance to launch his western offensive, as German resistor Georg Elser's bomb explodes in a Munich brewery just after Hitler has left the building. The Phoney War is a neglected period of the Second World War, but it might not have been if the Allies had struck in September 1939. But their strategy for a long war and their doubts mean that they remain on the defensive. After all, with their large empires and access to resources, France and Britain have the benefit of time, which Hitler doesn't. In the early stages of the war, the only way he can threaten the Allies' vast logistical connections is on and under the sea. Only 30 minutes after the British declaration of war on September 3, 1939, Berlin issues new orders to its U-boat fleet. Open hostilities against England immediately. Do not wait to be attacked first. The order is not a surprise. Since late August, U-boats have been positioned around the British Isles, while 2 Panzerschiffe, heavily armed cruisers also known as pocket battleships, are already at sea. But most of Dönitz's 46 operational U-boats are smaller 250-ton Type 2s, unsuitable for extended operations, while some U-boats will always be in transit, training, or repair. Meanwhile, the Allied navies have more ships, firepower, and experience, and the largest merchant fleet in the world. But this power is divided up across the globe, and the UK is vulnerable economically, importing almost all its oil and half of its food. Chief of the German Navy High Command, Erich Røde, quickly abandons Plan Z, a pre-war naval rearmament plan which prioritizes surface ships in favor of U-boat production. This is something U-boat fleet commander Karl Dönitz has been advocating for years. Røde's surface ships will become raiders to sink merchant shipping and force the Allied navies to divide their forces. But the British also act. Unlike in World War I, they introduce a convoy system from the very start of the war. They establish routes to Gibraltar, the Caribbean, and Canada, although ships which are either too slow or too fast for convoys sail independently. A fear of the German surface fleet means some early convoys are over-escorted by ships like battleships, cruisers, aircraft carriers, and submarines, the latter of which often cause confusion to jittery escorts. U-boats fire some of the first shots of the war. On September 3rd, U-30 torpedoes and sinks the SS Athenia, a passenger ship heading for Canada, in an apparent case of mistaken identity. U-30 Captain Fritz Julius Lemp claims it acted suspiciously, although this was later disproven. In any case, the British believe Germany has already shifted to unrestricted submarine warfare and will not follow pre-war treaties controlling submarine operations. The so-called prize rules, which Germany signed, state submarines must first warn unarmed, unescorted merchant vessels before an attack and assist with evacuations. In response to these early attacks, Britain arms some merchant ships with older guns. Some U-boat captains do stick to the prize rules. Merchantman Captain Thomas Prince recalls being brought aboard U-48. The submarine halted my boat alongside, and then ordered me to come on board and bring my papers. I told Captain Schulze I had none because I had already destroyed them. He then asked me to have a drink with him, so we both had a tumbler full of whiskey. He told me he would send an SOS, and wished me the best of luck and hoped we would meet again after the war was over. When I last saw him, he was standing in the conning tower with his hand on his forehead in a salute. But such policies do not last long. In response to armed merchant vessels and the impracticality of the rules in wartime, Røde announces a sink-on-sight policy on September 23rd for all enemy merchant vessels. U-boats also target warships and score some notable successes. A sub sinks British aircraft carrier HMS Courageous on September 17th, resulting in the withdrawal of carriers from escort duty. Then, on the night of October 13th and 14th, Lieutenant Commander Günther Priens U-47 sneaks into the British Home Fleet base of Scapa Flow through a 15-meter gap in the harbor's incomplete defenses. Moving at full speed on the surface to counter adverse currents, U-47 identifies the battleship Royal Oak anchored at port. At such moments, feeling turns off. One thinks with the boat. One is the brain of the steel animal which is creeping up on the great, overpowering ship. In such instances, one must think in iron and steel or go under. Ever nearer. Now one can clearly make out the couplings of the gun turrets from which the barrels point threateningly. The ship lies there, the lights turned off, like a sleeping giant. The first torpedo salvo does little damage, and the second misses. However, a third ignites the ship's ammunition storage, resulting in a massive explosion. The Royal Oak rapidly sinks with 786 crew. However, Germany also loses capital ships. In the South Atlantic, pocket battleship Graf Spee is on a rampage, sinking 9 merchantmen by December 1939. But its high-profile activities attract attention. After dueling with a British force at the River Plate, the British trap the damaged Graf Spee in Montevideo, and her crew scuttles her on December 17th. And so by the end of 1939, both sides can count achievements and failures. Britain has lost 706,000 tons of shipping, including several notable ships. However, its convoy system holds firm. Half of the lost ships hit mines, and almost all sunk merchantmen are independently routed ships or convoy stragglers. The British developed countermeasures to magnetic mines as well. And of the 5,756 ships which sail in convoy in 1939, submarines only sink 4. So although the 1939 Scapa Flow attack boosts German morale, U-boats are still not playing a critical role. This does not improve in early 1940, as U-boats and other ships are withdrawn for Operation Weserübung, the German invasion of Denmark and Norway. December 1939. British headlines are filled with a mystery. Where is the Altmark? After the Royal Navy defeat the German warship Graf Spee at the River Plate, the British are now after her supply ship, the Altmark. They want to rescue the 299 British prisoners aboard, but she escapes to Europe and enters Norwegian waters on her way to Germany. Norwegian authorities inspect the ship 3 times and allow her to pass, but the British intervene. They intercept the Altmark against Norwegian wishes, storm it, and liberate the prisoners. The Altmark incident plunges Norway into the very crisis it hoped to avoid. Britain and Germany accuse the neutral nation of favoring their enemy, and now fear the other side will occupy the country. Norway's neutrality will soon go up in smoke. In September 1939, neither Britain and France nor Germany have given much thought to Norway, although both sides expected to align with the Allies. Norway, however, declares its neutrality, and Foreign Minister Halvdan Koht hopes non-provocative politics will keep the country out of the war. But Norway does play a role. In 1939, Germany imports 22 million tons of iron ore, 9 million of which come from Sweden. The only winter import route is via the Norwegian port of Narvik, and Britain identifies this as a German strategic vulnerability. Complete stoppage of Swedish exports of iron ore to Germany would, barring unpredictable developments, end the war in a few months. Britain considers laying sea mines, a naval blockade, or occupying northern Norway and Swedish ore fields. Initially, Britain requests Norwegian permission to land troops, but Oslo refuses. Koht fears British action will provoke German armed reaction, and struggles to resist British pressure. Politically, ideologically, nationally, and personally, my affinity, as well as that of the nation, rested with the Allies. Still, the British had a demanding attitude that was difficult to accept, and continuously forced their issues onto us instead of negotiating affably. Instead, the ongoing winter war between Finland and the Soviet Union provides a useful pretext. Britain and France develop occupation plans ostensibly based on helping Finland, but scrap them when the Winter War ends in March 1940. Britain is out of options, so some, especially First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, push for mining Norwegian waters and German rivers. If the Germans retaliate, which London expects, an additional part of the plan, called R4, prepares troops for a rapid occupation of northern Norway. France is initially reluctant, but eventually agrees. After all, a German attack on Norway might weaken German forces on the Western Front. In early April 1940, British troops in Scotland prepare to land at 3 locations on the Norwegian coast, following the expected German reaction to mine laying. But before they make their move, Germany strikes first. Germany also worries about the Narvik route and fears Norway might give in to British diplomatic pressure, a fear heightened by Vidkun Quisling, the leader of the fascist Nationalsamling party. In meetings with Hitler, he exaggerates the possibility of an Anglo-Norwegian alliance and asks for help for a national socialist coup. Hitler refuses because the German Foreign Ministry and many generals distrust Quisling and his claims of influence in Norway. There are other German motivations for occupying Norway as well. Although countering British occupation is the main goal, controlling Norwegian coastal naval bases would improve German naval flexibility. In January 1940, Hitler orders preparations for Operation Weserübung. Under General Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, German planners work in secret and emphasize bold action. Hitler considered Operation Weserübung to be particularly daring, in fact, one of the rashest undertakings in the history of modern warfare. Precisely that would ensure its success. He described the state of anxiety he would feel until the success of the operation as one of the strongest nervous tensions of his life. The plan, accelerated by the Altmark affair, calls for 8,850 troops aboard ships and 3,500 paratroopers to occupy key ports, cities and airfields in a surprise landing. German troops will present their arrival as preempting a British invasion, but have orders to use all available force to overcome any Norwegian resistance. After securing Oslo, the Germans assume Norwegian King Håkon VII will surrender and legitimize the German occupation. To secure logistical routes, German forces will simultaneously invade Denmark. Not all in the German military are enthusiastic, though. The plan is the brainchild of a small group directly responsible to the Wehrmacht High Command, not the individual army, air force, or naval commands. Luftwaffe officers resent being kept out of planning, while some army commanders oppose the use of troops meant for the invasion of France. Although the Navy is more supportive, they worry about strong British opposition at sea. With German intelligence suggesting the British will soon move into Norway, Hitler sets Weserübung for April 9th. Just as British troops are starting to embark for the R4 operation, German warships enter the North Sea. Both Britain and Norway have some advance warning of the German move. On April 8th, a Polish submarine sinks a German merchant ship carrying troops and invasion supplies to Norway. The Norwegian Navy informs Oslo of a likely invasion force, but the Norwegian government is focused on reports of British mine laying. British naval intelligence also detects large-scale German naval movements, but misjudges them as a breakout attempt into the North Sea. This is reinforced when British destroyer HMS Glowworm engages a German force led by the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper. In an uneven battle, Hipper sinks Glowworm, but not before Glowworm rams and severely damages the Hipper. The British cancel the R4 operation and only now realize the German capital ships are screening an invasion force. So when the 6 German Navy groups head for their targets, their biggest concerns are mines and Norwegian coastal forts. On paper, these are strong defenses, but in practice, they barely exist. The mines haven't been laid, and gun crews lack experience and ammunition. Furthermore, when the first German troops land early on April 9th, confusion reigns. Although some Norwegian patrol craft engage the invasion force, there's little coordinated resistance. In many cases, German ships pass coastal forts before the alarm is even raised. Things are different, though, in Oslo. The Norwegians detect German ships headed by the heavy cruiser Blücher, although their identity is still unknown. Oslo's defenses are focused around the Oscarborg fortress, equipped with heavy 28-centimeter Krupp guns and underwater torpedo tubes. Although most secondary forts are unmanned, Oscarborg commander Oberst Birger Eriksson decides to fire on the intruding ships, whatever their nationality might be. Meanwhile, Blücher captain Heinrich Woldag doesn't think the Norwegians will fire. At 4:20 a.m., Blücher leads the fleet into the Oslo fjord, while smaller vessels land troops at coastal forts. The Oscarborg's guns fire on the Blücher, immediately knocking out its flak fire control and killing many troops preparing to disembark. Smaller guns from the Kopas and Husvik forts also open fire. The Blücher is unprepared for combat and crammed with troops, so the ship reacts slowly. Sonderführer Behrens aboard the Blücher recalls. It was not possible from below to distinguish between hits and our own artillery. Speed was increased. Suddenly, the cruiser was violently shaken and shifted sideways. The engines shut down and the lights went out, emergency lighting turning on shortly after. Nobody could tell us what had happened. Two of the Oscarborg's torpedoes hit Blücher, igniting stored ammunition. With fire spreading, Voldag orders to abandon ship. Inexperienced troops quickly flee, leaving bulkhead doors open and helping the spread of fire and seawater. As the Blücher rapidly sinks, the Norwegian guns turn on the heavy cruiser Lützow, forcing it to retreat. Oslo's defense, though, is short-lived. After an air battle between German Me-110s and Norwegian Gloucester Gladiators, German troops land at Oslo's Fornebu airport and advance from the landward side, capturing the city by 2 p.m. 21-year-old Gunnar Sonsteby is surprised to see German troops in the streets on his way to work. Everyone I met was as stupefied as me. But the brief resistance provides just enough time for King Håkon, the government, and much of Norway's gold reserves to evacuate. By midday on April 9th, Weserübung seems a success. Germany captures Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen, Stavanger, Kristiansand, and Oslo against light resistance. Simultaneously, German forces also invade Denmark. When the Germans overcome a few pockets of isolated resistance, the Danish government surrenders by 6 a.m. Germany now demands Norway surrender just as Denmark has. It justifies its actions as preempting a British invasion and claims Håkon can remain king in exchange for cooperation. Before King Håkon responds, there's more political drama in Oslo. Quisling, equally surprised by the German invasion, quickly claims to represent a new Norwegian government. Norwegian men and women, England has violated the neutrality of Norway. The German government has offered the Norwegian government its help. The government itself has fled. Under these circumstances, it is the duty and right of the National Samling movement to assume the powers of government. All Norwegians are hereby called upon to keep the peace. Berlin initially ignores him, but Hitler soon realizes Quisling could be useful and supports his statement. For King Håkon, surrender also means tacitly accepting Quisling as prime minister. In Elverum, north of Oslo, he tells his ministers, "My position is clear. I cannot accept the German demands. I have carefully examined my mind and my position, and I find that I cannot appoint Quisling prime minister, a man in whom I know neither our people as a whole nor its representatives have any confidence at all." Although Norwegian resistance remains scattered, it is growing. Before the king's announcement, Norwegian troops under Colonel Otto Røde repel a German attack on Elverum. Promoted to commander-in-chief of Norwegian forces, Røde plans to retreat towards Trondheim in anticipation of Allied intervention. German units in the south also plan to strike north and link up their forces. For Britain, Narvik remains a vital strategic target, and once they understand German intentions, British warships sail for the port. German troops capture Narvik quickly, though, on April 8th. This was essential, as after refueling, the 10 destroyers in the invasion armada were to return to Germany to avoid being trapped by the Royal Navy. However, only one fuel tanker arrived on time, which delayed refueling. Early on April 10th, 5 British destroyers blocked the fjord exit. Their commander, Captain Bernard Warburton Lee, knows he's outnumbered, but decides to attack with the element of surprise. As the British destroyers advance in poor weather, they evade German U-boats and attack the unprepared German fleet. At 4:30 a.m., British torpedoes hit German flagship Wilhelm Heidkamp, killing the flotilla commander. As the British destroyers make more attack runs, they sink the Anton Schmidt and damage 3 other destroyers in Narvik. But as the British begin to withdraw, 2 German destroyers surprise them from another fjord. Sailing in front of the British line, German destroyers Georg Thiele and Bernd von Arnim fire at close range, severely damaging British flagship HMS Hardy and mortally wounding Warburton Lee. HMS Hardy runs aground, although its guns continue to fire. The German destroyers then concentrate on HMS Hunter, which is accidentally rammed by HMS Hotspur and suffers significant damage. Hunter soon sinks with heavy losses. Both sides now withdraw. Losses are fairly even, but the Germans remain trapped in Narvik with only 2 undamaged destroyers and more British ships on the way. On April 13th, 9 fresh destroyers, led by battleship HMS Warspite, enter the fjord. German ships are low on ammunition and fuel, but have the protection of U-boats in the fjord. These launch 4 attacks on Warspite, but all the German torpedoes malfunction. Warspite and the destroyers now attack the crippled German fleet, which withdraws into a smaller fjord where Warspite cannot go. British destroyers pursue, and both sides exchange torpedoes and gunfire. The German gunnery is more accurate, but with nowhere to go, several German destroyers expend their ammunition and run themselves ashore. German destroyer Erich Giese, though, charges at HMS Punjabi and Bedouin, forcing Punjabi to retreat. At point-blank range, Bedouin reduces Giese to a burning wreck, which later sinks in Narvik harbor. Its captain knows the end has come. The proper duty of an officer and soldier is to inflict as much damage on the enemy as possible. We had about 10 minutes worth of ammunition and all torpedoes, so we could fight. But I had no hope that we would ever reach port again. The remaining German destroyers, Georg Thiele and Hans Lüdemann, attempt an ambush with their remaining torpedoes, the last of which hits HMS Eskimo. Having expended most of their ammunition, they run themselves aground, as HMS Hero and Icarus move in and shell the wrecks. By the end of April 13th, the British have sunk all 10 German destroyers at Narvik. However, the British do not immediately land troops, even though German army units have left Narvik. Instead, the Allies only make their counter-landings around Narvik and Trondheim on April 16th. For Otto Ruge, the help can't come soon enough. From April 11th, German forces push back Norwegian troops in all directions. The Norwegians only fight long enough to delay the Germans and not become trapped in combat against armor and motorized troops. When British troops come to Ruge's aid near Lillehammer, he's disappointed. Most are inexperienced and poorly equipped, partly due to the loss of a major supply ship, the Cedar Bank, to a U-boat. Whatever else had been on the Cedar Bank, we now had only our rifles, a few anti-tank rifles, and Bren guns to face the enemy with. Also, the clothes we stood up in. British troops do poorly in their first encounter with German land troops of the entire war. On April 23rd, German armor breaks through a British roadblock near Lillehammer as German Stukas bomb freely. German fighters also destroy all of the British biplanes sent to support the expedition within days. By April 24th, Britain decides to evacuate Trondheim. General Edmund Ironside knows this will outrage the French, whose troops have only just arrived from the front with Germany. I have now issued the orders for the eventual evacuation of the Central Norway force on a military basis. Ministers, including the Prime Minister, began making up stories they could tell the public. I dare say they will make a story that can pass muster. The thing that troubles me is that we have not taken the French into account. But as the Allies withdraw from Trondheim, a separate Allied force moves in around Narvik, where a victory still seems possible. The German commander there, Eduard Dietl, considers withdrawing. He has a force of around 4,600 troops, but half of them are sailors fighting as infantry. However, he receives mountain artillery via Ju-52 transports and supplies and German radio and engineering specialists via neutral Sweden. Overall, British troops lack aggression, and it takes them 2 weeks to advance 8 kilometers to the north of Narvik, though the weather is bad. By late April and early May, French and Polish troops, including Alpine experts, arrive, and eventually the Allied numerical superiority makes an impact. By late May, German troops near exhaustion against 25,000 Allied troops. The Allies launched their final assault on May 28th and captured Narvik after a short battle. Dietl and his remaining troops escaped towards Sweden. The Allies have finally secured a victory on land against Germany, but it is short-lived and mostly to save face. By June 8th, the Allies evacuate again and Dietl is back in Narvik. King Håkon and his government escape with the Allies, although Røste remains and surrenders with Norwegian forces on June 10, 1940. The Norway campaign cost Germany around 5,300 casualties, including 2,375 at sea. Allied and Norwegian losses are around 6,600, with around 2,500 at sea. Germany celebrates Weserübung as a decisive victory which prevents Allied action against the Swedish ore fields and secures new naval bases in the North Sea. Meanwhile, Allied hesitation potentially missed opportunities for better results, such as faster counter-landings against isolated German troops. Hitler considered retreating from Trondheim or Narvik several times and later described the Allied inaction. From a military point of view, it can only be described as frivolous dilettantism. But was Weserübung worth it for Germany? Although the campaign suffered light losses on land, it arguably crippled the Kriegsmarine for the remainder of the war. In addition to the Blücher and the 10 Narvik destroyers, Germany lost 2 light cruisers, 6 U-boats, and 10% of their transport capacity, severely reducing the navy. While the Royal Navy also suffered losses, including HMS Glorious during the final evacuation, it could sustain these losses. Larger German capital ships like Gneisenau and Scharnhorst also require extensive repair after an encounter with HMS Renown on April 9th. In the longer term, the German occupation of Norway eventually increases to 300,000 men, a large garrison for a secondary theatre. Meanwhile, ore exports from Narvik plummet throughout the war to negligible levels. But Hitler's not worried about these problems in summer 1940. Navies are essential for long, drawn-out global wars, and he intends to fight a short, sharp war in continental Europe. Victory in Norway adds to the growing impression of German military invincibility and vindicates the strategy of bold and even reckless action. As Allied troops evacuate Norway in late May, they already know that Hitler has launched his next major gamble, one which will make the Norwegian bases unnecessary and perhaps even win the war: the invasion of France. In May 1940, Nazi Germany attacks in the west. The Allied armies of France, Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands have more men, guns, and tanks than the Germans do, and the French army is considered the best in the world. But in just 6 weeks, German forces shock the world and smash the Allies. So how did the Allies lose so completely, so fast? When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Britain and France declared war. But the Western Allies do little as the German and Soviet armies crush the Poles, and German Chancellor Adolf Hitler is already planning his next move. He's in a hurry, since his alliance of convenience with the USSR might be short-lived, and the Allies aren't yet ready for war. On September 27th, Hitler tells the High Command he wants to attack France in a month. Nearly all the German generals, like Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, are stunned. The French will not be surprised. They know very well that if the Germans attack, they must do so through Belgium. So the French will be vigilant. Our bloody sacrifice will be great. An attack on France cannot be done like the attack on Poland. Rather, it will be arduous and very costly. Hitler ignores his generals' warnings and orders them to start planning an offensive to capture neutral Belgium and the Netherlands and occupy enough of northern France to be able to strike at Britain. The start date is moved to November 25th. Chief of the Army General Staff, Franz Halder, quickly prepares a cautious plan, with the main German advance through central Belgium. But Hitler is frustrated. This is just the old Schlieffen plan with a strong right wing along the Atlantic coast. One cannot get away with such an operation a second time. The back and forth between army planners and Hitler lasts for months, during which time the offensive is delayed 29 times. Hitler leans ever more towards the idea of concentrating the relatively few German armoured and motorised divisions for a strike through the thickly forested Ardennes region, cutting off Allied forces if, as expected, they enter Belgium. Army brass thinks it's too risky. Unbeknownst to Hitler, General Erich von Manstein also favours the Ardennes route for what becomes known as the Sichelschnitt or sickle cut plan, but the army command throttles it. Then in January 1940, a German Messerschmitt 108 Typhoon carrying the plan crashes in Belgium, forcing the Germans to change it yet again. Finally, on February 24, 1940, the final plan is approved, one that weakens Manstein's idea of a double pincer from north and south. Army Group B will simply pin the Allies in the north, while the Southern Army Group A will lead the attack through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River at Sedan, and race for the town of Abbeville, where the River Somme meets the sea. This is a risky plan, with precious armour moving through dangerous narrow forest roads and advancing with long and vulnerable flanks. Army Group B Commander General Fedor von Bock tells Halder the plan is dangerous. You will be creeping by 10 miles from the Maginot Line with the flank of your breakthrough and hope the French will watch inertly. You are cramming the mass of the tank units together into the sparse roads of the Ardennes mountain country, as if there were no such thing as air power. And you then hope to be able to lead an operation as far as the coast, with an open southern flank 200 miles long, where stands the mass of the French army? Meanwhile, the French and British are making plans as well, though international politics makes things difficult. French and British planners are confident in the Maginot Line and expect the Germans will attack through neutral Belgium and the Netherlands. The Dutch and Belgians, though, refuse to make detailed plans for Franco-British forces to enter their territory and cooperate with their armies, in the hopes of not provoking the Germans. Nonetheless, this is still the focus of the Allies' Plan D. The best French units and the British Expeditionary Force will move into the Low Countries if the Germans attack, and try to stop them along the Dial River, the Albert Canal, and forts like Eben Emael. Plan D is also risky. Allied forces won't have the initiative, they'll be advancing into the teeth of an enemy offensive, and the hinge of their line, the Ardennes, remains thinly defended since they consider it impassable for large armoured forces. French intelligence reports point to the Ardennes, but the High Command does nothing. There's also no strategic reserve, since the 7th French Army is to advance into the Netherlands, politically useful, but militarily questionable. On the eve of battle, the Germans have 2.8 million men, 7,500 guns, 4,000 planes, and 2,700 tanks and self-propelled guns on the Western Front. But only 16 of 157 German divisions are motorized. The Allies, including the still neutral Dutch and Belgians, have 3.7 million men, 14,000 guns, 3,000 planes, and 3,700 tanks. So with the Germans hoping for a daring Sichelschnitt, the Allies plan an uncertain advance into the Low Countries. On May 10, 1940, the Germans launch Case Yellow, a campaign that would shock the world and the Germans themselves. The Germans pour across the border into the Low Countries. They want to give the impression their main strike is in the Netherlands, and they even use troops in Dutch uniforms to seize bridges by surprise. German paradrops at Dutch airports mostly fail, though, thanks to Dutch army resistance. But in general, the Dutch offer little resistance. On May 14th, the Luftwaffe bombs the port city of Rotterdam to terrify the Dutch into surrendering, and it works. The attacks kill 800 civilians, though in the chaos, the Dutch government thinks 30,000 have been killed, and they leave parts of the city in ruins. The Dutch government flees, and the army surrenders on May 15th. Belgian troops also pull back quickly, though a few Belgian units don't receive the retreat order, and manage to hold up German tanks for several hours, a lesson Allied commanders miss in the confusion. When Franco-British troops belatedly start to move in the evening, their progress is slow on roads choked with fleeing refugees. The Belgians hope that Fort Eben Emael will hinder the Germans, but despite the Belgians giving the German air and glider-borne troops a tough fight, the attackers prevail on May 11th. Further south in the critical Ardennes, the Germans advance but encounter problems. The panzers are held up by blown bridges and roadblocks and form massive traffic jams up to 250 kilometers behind the front. Only now do the French realize the scale of the attack in the Ardennes. Local commanders requested reinforcements days ago, but none came. Now French Commander-in-Chief Maurice Gamelin quickly sends 3 divisions to help. Some Allied commanders fear their armies might be walking into a trap in Belgium, but Gamelin expects it will take the horse-drawn German artillery 9 days to reach the Meuse, and that it's too late to shift major forces south. On May 12th, while a major tank battle rages at Anu, in which 630 German tanks defeat a French force of 470, the Germans reach the river further south. General Erwin Rommel's 7th Armored Division and Heinz Guderian's 19th Corps both prepare to cross. In an ominous sign, French units facing Guderian withdraw without a fight. Many German tanks are the relatively weak Panzer I, II, and 38Ts, but they've arrived en masse with the element of surprise. Oberstleutnant Hermann Black notes the mindset of some French prisoners. The French are performing worse than poorly. When asked why they're at war with us, prisoners say, because England and the rich want war. We're not waging war, war is being waged with us. Their eyes glow with hate when they speak of England. The French were never this bad before. On May 13th, German infantry and recon cavalry crossed the Meuse at Dinant and Sedan. The French can't deal with the speed of the German advance, as one captured French general frankly admits. You are much too fast for us. It's everything. Even before the crossing, rumors spread amongst French troops that the Germans are already behind them, causing some units to break and flee. German success is due not only to the armored punch through the Ardennes, but also air power. The Luftwaffe consistently hits Allied columns, although air losses are very heavy on both sides. Aircraft like the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber pound French defenses on the Meuse before the ground troops get across. German tanks cross the Meuse on the 14th, but have taken heavy losses. Some units are down to 1/4 strength and lack ammunition and fuel. French forces prepare to counterattack the still fragile bridgeheads, and if they don't succeed, half of the Allied troops and their best motorized units will be cut off to the north. The crisis at the front is being felt in London and Paris as well. On May 10th, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain resigns and is replaced by Winston Churchill. A few days later, French Premier Paul Reynaud recalls General Maxime Weygand from Syria to take over command of the army and appoints Charles de Gaulle Deputy Minister of Defense. But he also asks First World War hero Philippe Pétain to be Deputy Premier, even though Pétain thinks the war is lost and blames Britain for starting it. Reynaud desperately requests 10 more British fighter squadrons to be sent to France. Churchill wants to send them, but the British cabinet is worried about home defence and only agrees to send 4. Some in London have lost hope in the French army, especially when Gamelin admits he has no strategic reserve. On the 15th, the Germans break out of their bridgeheads and advance up to 65 kilometers by evening. Gamelin recognizes the danger and orders Allied troops in Belgium to retreat. General von Bock wants to press his Army Group B's advantage in Belgium, but Army High Command worries that might ruin the sickle cut. Both German army groups stop for 3 days, to keep the northern Allied armies in the developing pocket and so infantry can catch up to protect the flanks against expected French counterattacks, a problem that Manstein's version of the plan had foreseen. Allied commanders, though, don't take advantage. When a French general admits that he has no idea what to do against the panzers, British General Henry Pownall loses his cool. My God, how awful to be allied to so temperamental a race. On the other hand, an engagement at the village of Stunn shows what French armour is capable of and why German commanders hesitate. Captain Pierre Biot's char B1 bis destroys 11 Panzer IIIs, 2 Panzer IVs, and 2 anti-tank guns, one of the most remarkable single-tank actions of the war. Despite Biot's heroics and the delay, on May 20th, the 2nd Panzer Division reaches the sea at Abbeville. They catch many French troops unprepared or in shock from continuous air attack. Lieutenant Alexander Stahlberg marvels at the destruction. The streets were lined with the wreckage of a defeated French army. Shot-up vehicles, pierced and burnt-out tanks, abandoned cannon, a never-ending chain of destruction. More than 1 million British and French troops are trapped north of the Somme, and the RAF has lost a quarter of its strength. The Allies desperately organize a double counterattack to hit the German flanks, but it's not clear who is in command of the cut-off forces, and the Germans are moving fast. Anglo-French forces do manage an effective attack near Arras on May 21st and 22nd, including Matilda tanks, but the hard-pressed Germans hold them off. Allied forces begin a fighting retreat to the port of Dunkirk for evacuation, a British decision that many French resent. The Germans are worried about more counterattacks from the south, so von Rundstedt asks Hitler to pause the advance on Dunkirk, and on May 24th, Hitler agrees. This is a much debated decision. Later in the war, Hitler will try to cover up his mistake and say that he wanted to avoid humiliating Britain in view of peace talks. After the war, von Rundstedt will say that Hitler gives the order, but this is a lie. In reality, von Rundstedt gives the order to stop, but tells his subordinates that the order came from Hitler so that they will obey. So why does von Rundstedt stop the tanks before Dunkirk? Well, he wants his tanks to prepare for an Allied counterattack from Dunkirk. He wants his infantry to have time to move up to the Somme line in case the French counterattack from the south. Panzer Commander von Kleist thinks that the area around Dunkirk isn't even suitable for tanks, and he wants the Fourth Army to secure Arras before attacking Dunkirk. And von Rundstedt, Hitler, and the Navy High Command all think that a speedy evacuation of the BEF is impossible. This means there's no need to waste precious Panzer IIIs or IVs on Dunkirk when they can be used against the French in the south, and the Germans have already lost 600 tanks. The Germans expect the artillery and Luftwaffe can destroy Allied forces in the pocket, and Fourth Army can then mop them up. But the German pause is not the only reason the BEF makes it out. On May 25th, British troops capture a German staff vehicle carrying documents detailing the location of the next German attacks. Lord Gort promptly sends reinforcements, which prevent the Germans from cutting off most British forces from Dunkirk, a move that may have saved the BEF. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of the BEF and French forces from Dunkirk, begins May 26th, and the BBC's call for private boats to help follows the next day. On the beaches and in the ships, there is chaos as German aircraft pound the helpless men below. Quartermaster Frank Harel is among the wounded. I got on a boat just after 7 that evening, and in the course of loading, an air raid came in. The ship got struck, and I found myself blown into the water. There were about 30 of us in the water. I could only doggy paddle because of my wounded leg, but I trod water and got myself back on the beach to wait for my chance again. Around the town, British and French units fight sacrificial rearguard actions to keep the Germans at bay. The last men escape on June 4th, and in all, about 700 British and 160 French vessels of all types managed to evacuate 193,000 British and 145,000 French troops. 88,000 mostly French troops defending the evacuation route are forced to surrender. German aircraft managed to sink 20 Allied warships and damage dozens more. Saving the BEF is an even more remarkable feat given the sudden surrender of the Belgian army on May 28th, without consulting the British or French. King Leopold controversially decides to give up and become a prisoner of the Germans. Even though the Allies do not plan to evacuate Belgian troops, they're outraged. Reynaud calls King Leopold a pig, and former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George calls his actions, quote, a sample of perfidy and poltroonery. The collapse of the Allied front also worsens tensions in London and Paris. Pétain and Pétain pressure Reynaud to pursue a separate peace with Germany, but he refuses. British Foreign Minister Halifax suggests peace talks via neutral Italy, but Churchill won't hear of it. Even if we are defeated, we won't be any worse off than if we stop fighting now. We must avoid being dragged into the abyss with France. With the BEF and the best French units either evacuated without their heavy weapons or captured, the Germans now turn their attention to the rest of the French army. South of the Allied disaster at Dunkirk, the front line runs along the Somme and Aisne rivers, and the Germans already have several bridgeheads. The Abbeville bridgehead threatens the remaining ports which the second BEF needs for supply. Churchill has ordered 300,000 fresh British troops to France despite the risks to, as he says, give the French the feeling that they're not alone. General Alan Brooke is not impressed. It's impossible to give a corpse any kind of feeling, and the French army is in fact dead. But there is some fight in the French yet. On May 27th, the French 7th Army attacks the Abbeville bridgehead, a battle that includes units of Charles de Gaulle's division and Manstein's corps. The B-1 bis tanks caused some German units to panic, but several 88mm German anti-aircraft batteries used in a ground roll stopped the piecemeal Allied armored attacks and preserved the German bridgehead. The Germans then launch Case Red on June 5th. Their plan is to cross the Somme and the Aisne and quickly drive south to break the French army before it can reorganize. First, Army Group B's 3 armies will advance to the Seine, Oise and Aisne rivers near Paris. Then, Army Groups A and B will strike the main blow east of Paris towards Troyes and Saint-Dizier. Army Group C will then start the 3rd phase by breaking the Maginot Line at Saarbrücken and continue the 4th phase by crossing the Rhine at Colmar. And the Germans now have twice as many divisions as the Allies. Weygand calls on French troops to defend their positions to the death, since the fate of France depends on the coming battle. He also introduces a new defensive tactic to defeat deep penetrations of German armor. French troops build so-called hérissons, or hedgehogs, fortified village and forest positions meant for all-round defense. These are to hold up German infantry, while Allied tanks are to take on German armor when it breaks through. At first, the hedgehogs work, as Luftwaffe General von Richthofen writes in his diary. What looked this morning like a success turned out to be nothing. The French are hard and tough. They've fortified all villages. Our tanks drive through, but the French lay low and pop up when our infantry tries to follow the tanks. The infantry can't screen for the tanks, so the tanks just drive on without them. The infantry can't make progress against the all-round defenses of the village. That's how everything bogs down. On June 5th and 6th, there's heavy fighting south of the Somme. Many troops obey Weygand and fight to the death. In some places, the Germans also murder French African colonial soldiers after they've surrendered. In fact, overall in the campaign, SS and Wehrmacht troops kill at least 3,000 French African and nearly 200 British and French prisoners, and several massacres of civilians take place, like at Vingt and Oigny. At one of the massacres of African troops, a German officer explains his actions to his French counterpart. An inferior race does not deserve to fight such a civilizing race as the German race. On June 6th, though, the Germans break through along the Chemin des Dames and cross the Aisne and cross the Somme in 2 places. Allied units along the Somme estuary retreat to the river Brel. Again, the German tanks are too fast, and they outflank the new Allied position by nightfall. On the 7th, General Hermann Hoth's panzers reach the crossroads at Forges-les-Eaux, a move that splits the French 10th Army in 2. Hoth wants to press on towards the rivers Seine and Rouen, but his superiors are nervous about his flanks, since Allied resistance holds up German infantry. Rommel, however, orders his 7th Division to race to the Seine without waiting for permission, not the only time German commanders improvise aggressively in this campaign. The French blow the Rouen bridges in time, but Hoth's breakthrough forces a general retreat which damages Allied morale. The Germans note that even French armored units that could have caused them problems avoid engagements, like at Otipin. The regiment met several lone enemy tanks, which retreated as soon as fired upon. Some crews left their vehicles without defending themselves. On June 9th, the 2nd phase of Case Red begins. Here as well, the Germans find many French fight hard. Army Group A reports mention effective French artillery fire and organized defenses. But other parts of the French army are crumbling, as a French staff officer notes. A stunned and haggard herd, complete mixture of units, regiments, and services. It's not so much a question of morale. These people are disoriented. They don't know what's happening to them. The sight of an airplane terrifies them. Soon the Germans break through everywhere. Guderian's panzers race south from the Aisne into the French rear, Manstein's infantry cross the Seine, and 9th Army reaches the River Marne, which they cross the next day. The British decide the military situation is hopeless and withdraw the 200,000 men of the 2nd BEF. Béguin declares the war is lost and France must make peace, but Reynaud tells him to fight on. You are taking Hitler for Wilhelm I, the old gentleman who took Alsace-Lorraine from us, and that was that. But Hitler is Genghis Khan. The Germans enter Paris on June 14th, same day the 3rd and 4th phases of the German offensive begin. Verdun, symbol of French resistance in the First World War, falls on the 16th, and the Germans reach the River Loire and the Swiss border. The French army is in tatters. Politically, the news is all bad for the Allies as well. On June 10th, Italy declares war on them, and Norway surrenders. By the 16th, most French cabinet ministers want an armistice, and Pétain threatens to resign if Reynaud doesn't ask for one, a fatal blow to the government. Reynaud asks President Roosevelt for help, but receives only empathy. London proposes that France and Britain unite as one state to continue the war, but Pétain suspects it's a British plot to take French colonies and calls it a marriage to a corpse. He also wants peace to avoid a potential communist uprising. Reynaud resigns, Pétain becomes premier and asks for an armistice the next day. Some Frenchmen do want to resist, like de Gaulle, who makes a radio broadcast from England calling on his countrymen to continue the fight. Few hear him on that day, but that will change. While armistice negotiations begin, Mussolini decides he wants an Italian victory before the war ends. On June 21st, 22 Italian divisions attack in the Alps, but just 6 French divisions don't let them get far. To preserve Italian feelings, the Germans send air and ground forces to hit the French from behind, and there's heavy fighting in the mountains June 23rd and 24th. Finally, on June 25, 1940, the armistice takes effect. The Battle of France lasts 46 days and takes the lives of 2,900 Dutch, 7,500 Belgian, 12,500 British, 59,000 French, 45,000 German, and 1,250 Italian soldiers. Nearly 30,000 French, Dutch, and Belgian civilians die, while 8 million become refugees. Over 2 million French and Belgian soldiers become prisoners of war. The material destruction reflects the scale of the German victory. The Germans lose 1,800 planes and the Allies 3,020. The Germans lose 839 tanks and the Allies 3,300. Almost immediately, debates raged about why the German victory was so fast and so complete. General Gamelin blames the cowardice of the soldiers. De Gaulle says that the army was used improperly, and Pétain that the country was spiritually weak. Officer, historian, and later resistance fighter Marc Bloch emphasizes the incompetence of the High Command. In the end, the Allies failed in the field because they could not react to the speed and power of the concentrated German armor. They underestimated the effects of tactical air power, they couldn't coordinate their actions to exploit German errors, and they suffered from infighting and partial loss of morale. The German victory shocks Allied governments and publics, including the neutral US, which reconsiders its global security, and comes as a welcome surprise in Germany. German propaganda celebrates the triumph as a blitzkrieg by the tanks, an image that persists until today, even though it was the infantry that did most of the fighting. German leaders now overestimate their own abilities and military strength, and since Hitler's prestige is at its peak, few will question him from now on. German leaders overlook their mistakes, like exposing their flanks and lacking ammunition supplies, because they got away with them. France is lost, but Britain is still in the fight. This means for now, German strategic interest remains in the West, which benefits the Soviet Union. Stalin now moves against other small states to expand his empire. Moscow wants to expand beyond its gains in Finland and Poland, and the war in Western Europe gives it the chance to target other former parts of the Russian Empire, like the Baltics and Romanian-controlled Bessarabia. Nazi Germany has given tacit approval to Soviet expansion in the Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939, and for the Soviets, occupying these areas will provide a buffer zone against Germany if the pact fails. After the invasion of Poland, Moscow makes fresh demands of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. Relations with Estonia are already damaged, as in mid-September, a Polish submarine escapes from Tallinn. This angers the Soviets, who wanted the Estonians to detain it. Soviet officials claim the incident shows Estonian security failings and demand a one-sided security pact. Under the agreement, the Soviet Union could station 35,000 troops in Estonia to, quote, protect order. The Soviet government offers similar pacts to Latvia and Lithuania, but they sweeten the Lithuanian deal by offering up the city of Vilnius, also known as Vilno, which Poland had controlled since 1919. Estonia asks Germany for help, but receives none. Under Soviet intimidation, Estonian President Konstantin Päts and his government reluctantly accept the agreement on September 28, 1939. To refuse the Soviet proposal would mean to knowingly send the entire Estonian people to their death. By mid-October, Latvia and Lithuania also sign. The Soviet Union quickly exceeds the terms, stationing more troops and seizing more bases than agreed. Initially, Soviet officials like Comintern chief Georgy Dimitrov hoped to bring the Baltic states closer to the USSR. We have found the right form to allow us to bring a number of countries into the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. We are not going to seek their Sovietization. The time will come when they will do that for themselves. By summer 1940, though, the Soviet attitude fully shifts. With global attention focused on France and relations with Baltic governments further deteriorating, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov accuses the Baltic nations of secretly forming an anti-Soviet alliance. Moscow delivers ultimatums to form new pro-Soviet governments. While the Baltic governments debate these ultimatums, Soviet troops stage provocations and move into key cities. By June 16th, the Red Army has occupied the Baltics entirely. The Soviet Union then conducts fraudulent elections for new governments who request to join the USSR as Soviet republics. Soon after, the NKVD oversees thousands of mass arrests and the deportation of tens of thousands more to the east. The Romanian provinces of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina experience a similar fate. The Russian Empire conquered them from the Ottomans in 1812, and in 1918 they came under Romanian control following a popular vote. The Soviet Union refuses to recognize the decision, and secret clauses of the Nazi-Soviet Pact assign the provinces to the Soviet sphere. France and Britain have guaranteed Romania's territorial integrity, but this is largely aimed against Germany, not the Soviet Union. In any case, by summer 1940, the British and French are in no position to help. On June 26, 1940, the Soviet Union issues an ultimatum to Romania to withdraw from Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. The Soviets claim the areas are mostly ethnically Ukrainian and that locals suffer under Romanian rule. With the Red Army massing on the border, Romania accepts the ultimatum on June 28 and withdraws. On August 2nd, the Soviet Union annexes the territory and begins deportations. International reaction to the annexations is muted. Although the US condemns them, Britain is more cautious. It does not recognize the Soviet annexations, but does not publicly oppose them either. Some ministers even recommend a de facto recognition to improve relations with the Soviet Union, since Britain is now scrambling for allies and survival after the defeat of France. In early June 1940, Britain and France are in peril. German panzers close on Paris, while hundreds of thousands of Allied troops scramble to evacuate. On June 10th, Italy invades southern France, and although the attack fails, it expands the war. The Mediterranean theater now stretches from the Horn of Africa to the Strait of Gibraltar. Along this Mediterranean river are several natural choke points, which are lifelines for Britain's global empire, and naval bases at Gibraltar, Malta, and Alexandria. If Britain hopes to win the war, it must rally its imperial power. Since the mid-1930s, Italy has expanded its imperial reach in Africa and the Balkans, and the British worry because of their high estimations of Italian capabilities. The Royal Navy initially recalls ships from the Mediterranean fleet to British waters. They're desperately needed to defend the United Kingdom against German U-boats and a possible German invasion. But Churchill cancels the move. Britain's strategy is to turn the war into a longer attritional conflict, and it requires the Mediterranean and access to its wider empire to do it. By 1939, the British Empire, or Commonwealth of Nations, includes 25% of the world population, around 470 million people, 30% of its landmass, and vast amounts of natural resources. From the beginning, Britain's Second World War is an imperial war. London uses its imperial reach, especially via the navy, to dominate global trade in a long-term economic strategy against Germany, and to protect supply lines to Britain. Meanwhile, its enemies work to undermine this system and threaten its colonies. Britain fights an imperial war partly due to prestige, but also out of necessity. The country imports 60% of its food, including 90% of grains and 50% of meat. Most comes from the empire, as Winston Churchill's son Randolph explains. If we lose our empire, we shall become not a second-rank, but a 10th-rank power. We have nothing. We will all die of hunger. So there is nothing for it but to fight to the end. Mobilizing Commonwealth resources, though, is not straightforward. Britain mostly relies on its so-called White Dominions, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Newfoundland and South Africa, as well as the colony of India, for military manpower. Britain's declaration of war in 1939 automatically includes Australia and New Zealand, but unlike in 1914, both nations also formally declare war themselves. New Zealand Prime Minister Michael Savage states, "Where Britain goes, we go. Where she stands, we stand." Cultural, social and political ties to Britain result in wide support in Australia and New Zealand, but service overseas is controversial. Although there's an initial rush of volunteers, both dominions struggle to maintain recruitment. Uncertainty about troop deployment, low pay, and rules preventing key economic workers volunteering play a role. South Africa has more problems. The majority of South Africa's white population, which can vote, unlike black South Africans, speak Afrikaans and descend from Dutch settlers. Their contentious history with the British Empire due to the Boer Wars caused many to support neutrality or even a German victory. However, after a neutrality debate collapses the government, new Prime Minister Jan Smuts pledges South Africa to the war. But he struggles to find recruits for the new mobile field force, since laws barring non-European South Africans from military service leave just 5% of military-aged men eligible. Canada is the last major dominion to declare war on September 10, 1939. Prime Minister W.L. Mackenzie King also negotiates a sensitive domestic environment. Although most Anglo-Canadians support helping Britain, French Canadians are less enthusiastic, and memories of the divisive conscription crisis of 1917 loom large. King opposed conscription in 1917 and now draws significant electoral support from French Canada, so Ottawa adopts a policy of limited liability. Canada will prioritize air and sea forces to limit casualties, although it also raises an infantry division for overseas service. Recruitment goes well, and by the end of September, the Canadian Army has grown tenfold. Generally, Commonwealth mobilization is uneven. The relative inactivity of the so-called Phoney War until April 1940 makes the war effort seem less urgent, including for potential volunteers. However, after Germany's invasion of France in May 1940, most dominions, especially Australia and New Zealand, see a rapid expansion in recruitment. Australian politician J.V. Fairbairn states, "When the lion roars, the cubs will answer the call." Unlike most dominions, New Zealand introduces conscription for overseas service and pledges every atom of the country's services to the British Empire. And it's not just dominions who are expected to contribute. British-ruled India's large population also provides significant forces. Even in peacetime, the Indian Army numbers around 250,000, mostly recruited from communities the British consider to be martial races, like Sikhs, Punjabi Muslims, and Gurkhas. Britain also sees these groups as more loyal than the majority Hindus. But mobilization remains sensitive. The Indian National Congress and independence movement, including Mahatma Gandhi, wants promises of self-rule in exchange for help. When the British Viceroy only offers a review of India's colonial position, Congress ministers resign. However, the Indian Army remains loyal, and by 1940, Indians form 5 new infantry and 1 new armored division. Sensitivity around conscription means all these troops are volunteers. Many join for practical benefits like money or housing, and although the colonial authorities dilute the martial race theory, by early 1941, 48% of recruits are Punjabi and 11% are from Nepal. Not all colonies mobilize fighting troops, but all must contribute to the war effort. Kenya, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Malaya provide naval personnel, while many colonies function as important base areas. To ensure stability, Britain suppresses anti-colonial political movements. For many colonies, especially smaller islands and outposts, the war has a disproportionate impact. Britain, of course, is not the only imperial power at war. Mussolini's Italian empire might be smaller, but he has dreams of expansion. Mussolini hopes contributing to German victory may earn him major gains, like the seizure of the French fleet, the occupation of France and Corsica, and French colonies like Tunisia or French Somaliland. On June 11th, Italy bombs British-controlled Malta, but elsewhere, Britain takes the initiative. From June 10th, British armoured cars and tanks raid across the Egyptian border into Italian Libya. Most Italian troops lack heavy modern equipment or experience in modern war. Instead, they're trained for colonial pacification. In one engagement, Italian forces form a 19th century style fighting square, which British tanks easily destroy. In 3 months of combat, the Italians suffer 3,500 casualties for Britain's 150. Britain can't go on a wider offensive because it too lacks men and materiel. Meanwhile, French capitulation frees up Italian forces, and Mussolini demands an invasion of Egypt to eliminate the main British Mediterranean port of Alexandria and seize the Suez Canal. But his commanders are reluctant. After friendly fire kills respected Commander-in-Chief Italo Balbo, Rodolfo Graziani takes over. He's a desert expert, but his experience is mostly against Senussi tribesmen. Mussolini is encouraged by Italian success in East Africa, where his colonial forces have pushed back a small British garrison. But although Graziani outnumbers the roughly 36,000 British-led troops, he lacks vehicles, water, and supplies. After lengthy delays and pressure from Rome, he reluctantly invades British Egypt on September 13th, setting a modest first objective of Sidi Barrani, 80 kilometers from the border. As Italian troops advance, Graziani makes a grandiose statement. One wonders when the English will begin to understand that they have just dealt with the best fitted-out colonial army in the world, and when they finally learn to appreciate the valor of the Italian soldier. British troops withdraw, and Graziani orders his men to build fortified camps around Sidi Barrani, again following colonial practices. Mussolini pressures him to advance another 130 kilometers along the coast, but Graziani knows his troops are unlikely to make it. Italy's success in Egypt is partly due to redeploying Italian troops guarding the border with French colonies after France's defeat, an event that shakes the French Empire. Although 7,000 French troops in Britain and some colonial administrators joined Charles de Gaulle's Free French forces, most French troops remain loyal to the new collaborationist Vichy regime. Britain now worries about the Vichy French Navy, the fourth largest in the world. Before the French surrender, Britain asks French Admiral Jean-François Darlan about his intentions. He compares these requests to heirs visiting a dying man, and claims he would scuttle the French fleet before surrendering it to Germany. In armistice negotiations, Hitler doesn't seize the French fleet, likely to encourage France to make peace immediately. Churchill and many others in Britain have no faith in either German or French promises, even if Darlan is sincere. It is a matter so vital to the safety of the whole British Empire, we could not afford to rely on the word of Admiral Darlan. Especially important is the fleet at Mers el-Kebir in French Algeria, around 40% of the French Navy, including 4 capital ships. British Vice Admiral James Somerville can't blockade the port forever, so he delivers an ultimatum to French Vice Admiral Marcel Brunot-Gensoul: hand over control, scuttle or intern his ships, or be attacked. Many British naval officers, including Somerville, are anxious for moral and military reasons, but the cabinet unanimously supports the newly named Operation Catapult. Jean-Sul is sympathetic to British demands, but vows he will meet force with force, and the French Admiralty says it will send reinforcements. Britain intercepts this message and encourages Somerville to act. At 5 p.m. on July 3rd, negotiations end. Jean-Sul warmly embraces British negotiator Captain Cedric Holland, before Holland leaves the ship to the sound of French bugles calling battle stations. Jean-Sul doesn't believe Britain will attack and takes no other preparations. All his capital ships are moored with their guns uselessly facing landward. When Somerville opens fire at 5:54 p.m., it's a one-sided battle. The British fire 36 salvos, a magazine hit blowing up Bretagne with 1,000 crew and sinking the Provence. Jean-Sul's flagship, Dunkerque, runs ashore, and after 20 minutes, he requests a ceasefire. During the battle, the Strasbourg and 5 destroyers escape to Toulon. Somerville later writes, "For letting the battlecruiser escape and not finishing off more French ships, I shouldn't be surprised if I was relieved forthwith. The truth is, my heart wasn't in it, and you're not allowed a heart in war." The French lose 1,297 killed and 351 wounded, while the British lose just 2 of each. Much of France is outraged by the attack, but Churchill believes it shows determination and resolve to the wider world. While the British attack at Mers el-Kébir, they also seize French ships in Alexandria, meaning Britain neutralizes half the French fleet in one day. After the attack, Free French recruitment plummets. Hitler believes the British attack benefits Germany by causing division amongst the Allies and possibly encouraging Vichy France to join the Axis. The dramatic summer of 1940 after the Phoney War means neutral states take more notice, and both sides rush to make the most of diplomatic opportunities. For Britain, the United States is the most powerful and viable ally. US reaction to the Mers el-Kébir attack is mixed in public, but privately, officials are impressed. The attack erodes a common US perception of the British military as slow and overly cautious. British propaganda tries to show Americans Britain is still fighting, to encourage any US intervention. The popular British-produced film London Can Take It plays extensively across the US, while US reporters in the UK talk up British resolve. So far, the Blitz on London is a failure. London is no more knocked out than the man who smashes a finger is dead. By late 1940, Roosevelt discusses intervention in his fireside chats. Although he doesn't speak in favor of direct intervention, he claims the US must become the arsenal of democracy by supplying arms. Hitler also looks for allies in 1940. His military successes make it appear a German-dominated Europe is likely, and fellow fascist governments in Spain or Vichy France seem to be potential co-belligerents. But Germany, Vichy France, Italy, and Spain have more historical and territorial disputes between each other than they do with Britain, especially around the Mediterranean. Mussolini demands French colonies in North Africa, but Hitler refuses so he can sign a quick peace with France and encourage economic collaboration. Spanish dictator Francisco Franco hints at joining the war in summer 1940, but despite German assistance for Franco's nationalists during the Spanish Civil War, relations are poor. Germany demands immediate payment for their help, and many Spanish rightists oppose Hitler's pact with Stalin. Many Spaniards are also concerned about the German Soviet occupation of Catholic Poland, and in any case, Spain is economically unprepared for war. Hitler and Franco do meet in October 1940, and after marathon negotiations, Franco secretly agrees to join the Axis and allow Germany to attack British Gibraltar from Spain. In exchange, Spain will receive French colonies and France will receive captured British colonies in the future. But Germany will have to supply grain and military equipment, and Spain does not agree to any fixed date to join the war. Both sides understand the agreement is weak, although Spain does allow German U-boat refueling. Franco is also not convinced that Germany has won the war, and recent events over the skies of Britain show Hitler isn't victorious just yet. Summer 1940, the United Kingdom is gripped by the fear of a German invasion. France has been defeated, and a German air and seaborne assault on the British Isles looks imminent. As both Britain and Germany scramble to prepare, their air forces fight for control over the skies of Britain. For Germany, victory is essential for an amphibious landing. But even if they do win, could Germany ever really invade Great Britain? By June 1940, Britain is in a deep and growing crisis. German forces have decisively defeated France, resulting in the evacuation from Dunkirk. On June 10th, Norway surrenders following a German amphibious invasion, while on June 30th, Germany occupies the Channel Islands, British sovereign territory. Britain's pre-war plans did not foresee the country faced with German-occupied territory from Norway to the Spanish border. In June, Britain's home forces number 15 infantry divisions and 1 armoured division, and most are understrength and undertrained. More troops arrive via evacuations, the Commonwealth, and through hasty recruitment, but there's not enough equipment to go around. British forces rush to build chains of pillboxes, mortar emplacements, and fortified houses across the country, especially along the coastal crust and interior general headquarters lines. There are also more novel defences, such as the flame fougasse, barrels of napalm fired at invaders. Pre-prepared stay-behind guerrilla units are expected to hit flimsy German logistical routes after an invasion. There's also a mass recruitment drive for the new local defense volunteers. Within 6 days of its formation in May, 250,000 men outside of conscription age sign up. But with only 70,000 rifles to arm them, they'll use anything to fight. Improvised weapons could be usefully supplemented by a packet of pepper to interfere with the vision of any persistent unwelcome visitor. British fears stem from overestimating German power, especially in terms of tanks, mechanization, and airborne troops. Paratroopers in particular seem to render the Channel impotent as a defensive barrier. A June 1940 pamphlet warns, "Remember that if parachutists come, they will not be feeling at all brave. They will want you to give them food, means of transport, and maps. Do not give any German anything. Do not tell him anything. Hide your food and your bicycles. Hide your maps. See that the enemy gets no petrol." To British leaders, the German plan to dominate Europe is succeeding, and they're next on the list. We may therefore be sure there is a plan, perhaps built up over years, for destroying Great Britain, which, after all, has the honor to be Germany's main and foremost enemy. But Adolf Hitler has no plan for defeating Britain. A November 1939 Kriegsmarine report envisioned an invasion in East Anglia, but was not optimistic about its chances. In early July, Hitler tells his generals he still hopes Britain will surrender. Hitler astonished us by speaking with admiration of the British Empire. He said that all he wanted from Britain was that she should acknowledge Germany's position on the continent. He concluded by saying that his aim was to make peace with Britain on a basis that she would regard as compatible with her honor to accept. But on July 16th, with RAF bombers now striking German targets in Europe, Hitler orders preparations for Operation Sea Lion in somewhat tentative terms. Since England, in spite of her hopeless military situation, shows no signs of being ready to come to an understanding, I have decided to prepare a landing operation against England and, if necessary, to carry it out. The Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine rush to develop a plan, but all three have different priorities and expectations. The army favors a surprise invasion across a broad front by up to 40 divisions with tanks. A tactical analysis expects the operation to be similar to a large river crossing, in which aggressive spirit prevails. It is assumed that the battle is conducted in the manner of an attack across a river, but that no fire protection can be provided from the jumping offshore. Alle Führer gehören nach vorn. Ihr Beispiel entscheidet. All leaders need to be in front. Their example decides. The Navy points out that this is impossible. They don't have the transport to move 40 divisions and want a more concentrated attack to focus resources and evade the more powerful Royal Navy. General Franz Halder angrily responds, "I utterly reject the Navy's proposal. From the point of view of the Army, I regard the proposal as complete suicide. I might as well put the landed troops straight through the sausage machine." The result is a compromise. The assault force is scaled down to 13 divisions, 90,000 men, landing at 3 main locations isolated from the Royal Navy by mines. Supported by paratrooper drops, German forces would secure a line from Gravesend to Warsash. If successful, another force would land in Dorset and push for Bristol. As the invasion force increases to 260,000 German troops, they would push to a new line from Gloucester to Malden, encircling London. Planners expect that threatening the capital will lead to capitulation as it had in France. But the plan has many flaws. Surprise is impossible due to tidal variations along the landing beaches, which means invading forces will land at different times. The 12 hours between the first 2 assault waves means defenders and the Royal Navy could isolate the beachheads or mount counterattacks. Germany has no marine infantry, little experience in amphibious landings, and lacks specialized equipment, especially landing craft. There are a few prototype landing craft in development, but the Kriegsmarine requisitions 2,400 continental river barges as transports to make up a deficit of 1.35 million tons in shipping. Some will need to be welded together to make it across the channel, while many would be permanently grounded after landing. Aside from a weak plan and lack of shipping, another obstacle is the Royal Air Force. So Hitler orders Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring to achieve air superiority over southern England as a prelude to an invasion in late September. The RAF is battered after the Battle of France. They lost 1,500 killed, including 300 pilots and 950 aircraft over France. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 3,600 killed or missing, with 1,400 aircraft lost. Most Luftwaffe losses, though, were bombers or transports, while most RAF losses were fighters vital for the defense of Britain. RAF Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding resisted calls to send more RAF fighter squadrons to France once it was a lost cause, but average experience level is low. Technology and tactics are also critical, which is why we talked to military aviation expert Christoph Bergs.
To set the stage for any invasion, the Luftwaffe had to achieve air superiority over Britain. During the ensuing battle, both sides quickly realized that, well, the twin-engine fighters, Bf-110s, the dive bombers, the Ju-87s, and the biplanes, Gloucester Gladiators, and all the bombers were very vulnerable. In fact, the highest RAF crew losses during the battle was from Bomber Command, flying missions into Germany. Yet, the battle for air superiority would be largely fought between the fighters, the Spitfires, the Hurricanes, and the Bf-109s. Here we have, of course, the classic debate, Spitfire versus Bf-109, which was superior. Well, actually, both planes are remarkably similar, with almost equal performance. They had short range, they were fast, they had strong climbs, and technologically sophisticated for the time. Stronger firepower, a better initial dive, and direct fuel injection spoke in favor of the Bf-109. But the Spitfire was better in sustained turns, but it did lack direct fuel injection and heavy firepower. Then there was of course pilot skill and tactics. Though they had taken quite substantial losses in France, the Luftwaffe pilots on the whole had more combat experience. They preferred attacking from above and operated in pairs, so the Røste, with a 4-plane Schwarm formation. And as such, they actually used the same sort of 2-ship, 4-ship configuration that we largely see in use today with modern air forces. The RAF instead flew in a tight 3-plane Vic formation, the standard of the time. Wingmen concentrated on maintaining formation and following the leader. And this made the formation rather unwieldy once in the air and very slow to respond to sudden threats. At first, Fighter Command was somewhat reluctant to introduce changes and tactical reforms, as retraining takes time that Britain didn't have. And as such, some squadrons started to modify tactics on their own initiative. Yet 3 important elements spoke in favor of Britain. First, we of course have the geography. German fighters had limited range, and that limited their combat time over Britain. By contrast, British pilots could land and even resume the fight half an hour later after being, well, refueled and rearmed. Also, British pilots, when in need, bailed out over friendly territory and could thus take up the fight again if they were not wounded, unlike the German pilots who were captured. The second advantage was radar. Now, radar, or the chain home radar system, could identify Luftwaffe formations long before they crossed the channel, giving the RAF ample time to scramble fighters. Radar was part of the first sophisticated integrated air defense system, including, of course, next to radar, the ground observers and the filter rooms that would quickly disseminate all that important information to the anti-aircraft batteries as well as the squadron bases. This meant that the Luftwaffe could not attack at surprise. Finally, the Luftwaffe was fighting a battle it was not designed for. While it certainly focused on bombers as the main tool of delivering air power, this was very much entrenched in German operational thinking. It had been created mainly for continental operations, as we saw in Poland and France. And over Britain, it was fighting a battle that probably no air force was equipped to win in 1940.
In July 1940, the Battle of France makes way for the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe has approximately 2,200 immediately serviceable aircraft, mostly bombers and dive bombers in Luftflotten 2 and 3 across the Channel and Luftflotte 5 in Norway. They will face off against roughly 640 combat-ready aircraft, mostly Hurricanes and Spitfires, in the 4 main RAF fighter command groups. The brunt of the attack is expected to fall against number 11 group, commanded by New Zealander Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, with the other groups providing support as needed. From mid-July to August 12th, the Luftwaffe launches the Kanalkampf, the Channel Battle. Fighting over the English Channel, they aim to bomb British convoys and force RAF fighters into dangerous dogfights over the water. These early air battles disprove some interwar theories on aerial combat, like the idea aircraft equipped with rear gunners outmatch single-seat fighters. British Bolt and Paul Defiance, German Stukas and Bf-110s suffer high losses to modern fighters. Luftwaffe losses outnumber RAF losses, but Dowding realizes he cannot match Luftwaffe raids plane for plane without unsustainably high casualties. Eventually, British convoys stop using the Channel and mostly give up the airspace to the Luftwaffe. It appears Göring has won the opening phase. In reality, the RAF recovers and gains new pilots every week, including from the Commonwealth, German-occupied nations, and the RAF Volunteer Reserve. But pilot experience varies greatly. New arrivals have as little as 9 hours flight time in an operational unit, with no aerial combat training. In Phase 2 of the battle, the Luftwaffe targets coastal radar installations, RAF bases, and aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe does knock out some radar stations, but it's hard for them to confirm damage, and they don't target the stations consistently, meaning damage is quickly repaired. As fighting moves over southern England, Dowding only sends up enough fighters to challenge Luftwaffe bombers and disrupt raids. These tactics make the Luftwaffe think the RAF is on its last legs, and Göring plans a knockout blow in mid-August called Adlerangriff, Eagle Attack. From August 13th to 19th, the Luftwaffe launched mass attacks against RAF fighter infrastructure, peaking on August 15th with 1,800 sorties. The skies over southern England are filled with daily dogfights as casualties mount on both sides. A lack of ammunition means combat is often short and sharp. Tracers passed above and below, curving downwards and giving the impression of flying in a gigantic cage of gilt wire. I looked for another target, and a Hun passed just to the right of me and slightly above. I raised the nose and at about 75 yards, opened fire. After 2 or 3 seconds, the steady rhythm of the Hurricane's 8 Browning machine guns turned into a series of feeble clicks. A quick glance in the mirror showed 3 more 109s on my tail, so I flicked the Hurricane on its side, skidding and turning until I was going flat out. The Luftwaffe damages several air bases and ammunition depots, but the British repair most of the damage, and the Germans rarely launch follow-up attacks. One experimental unit, Erprobungsgruppe 210, has success using Bf-110s in a ground attack role, but the Luftwaffe resists tactical change. Most Bf-110s remain as vulnerable heavy fighters. Historian Stephen Bungay concludes, Had all the Bf-110 crews been retrained to deliver fast, low-level pinpoint attacks in the way that Erprobungsgruppe 210 were, Göring would have had a war-winning weapon in his hands. There are also German intelligence failings. The Luftwaffe loses around 50 planes attacking non-fighter command bases, and they mistakenly assume all RAF strength is concentrated in the south. On August 15th, a poorly escorted force of Heinkel bombers from Norway attempts to raid northern England, anticipating few defensive fighters. British reserve fighters in No. 13 Group intercept it and destroy almost 20% of the raiders. From August 13th to 19th, the Luftwaffe loses 363 aircraft, mostly bombers, destroyed or damaged to all causes. The RAF loses just 178. The British are downing German planes, but almost all British losses are fighters, and for the first time, losses are higher than replacements. British men and machines are wearing out. The Luftwaffe, though, is also exhausted. Fighter pilot Ulrich Steinhilper flew 7 sorties in one day. Although most of us were still not outwardly showing major signs of nerves, arguments were becoming more frequent, tempers frayed quicker. The strain of unrelenting frontline flying was beginning to show. However, experience does improve Luftwaffe tactics. They use feints to confuse British radar, and by late August, the Luftwaffe better understands the RAF sector system, hitting fighter air bases like Biggin Hill daily. Squadron leader Deacon Elliott recalls. No sooner had the squadron landed and refueled than the Germans bombed the airfield. This the second time in 2 days running. And the place was a terrible shambles. 29 killed yesterday, another 7 today. The RAF still has more pilots than planes, but numbers are dropping, from 1,400 pilots in July to 1,000 by the end of August. Czechoslovakian and Polish pilots in Britain are now fully mobilized despite Dowding's concerns about language problems. The losses also trigger strategic debates and tension between commanders. No. 12 Group Commander Trafford Leigh-Mallory, with the support of fighter ace Douglas Bader, believes mass big-wing formations are more effective at countering bombers than Dowding and Park's smaller interceptions designed to preserve strength. But Park argues such formations take too long to form up, especially in No. 11 Group, which often only has minutes to respond to raids. Big-wing experiments by No. 12 Group are mostly unsuccessful. But the so-called Big Wing controversy remains a point of contention between RAF commanders throughout the remainder of the battle and beyond. Meanwhile, in German-occupied ports, the invasion armada assembles. On September 7th, British commanders announce Cromwell, the code word warning of imminent invasion. Their decision is informed by other events. The same day, Luftwaffe bombers shift from attacking RAF bases to hitting London. Some claim the change is because Hitler is outraged by an RAF raid on Berlin, which was retaliation for an earlier, likely accidental bombing of London. Others think Göring hopes to provoke the RAF into a final battle that would damage British morale before an amphibious landing. The result, however, is a reprieve for the RAF. Attacks on RAF bases slow down, and although they're still losing fighters, the infrastructure to replace them recovers. 11 Group Commander Keith Park recalls. On the late evening of 7 September, I flew over London, and I can assure you that the East End of London and the Thames estuary were a grim sight. However, though I felt very angry, I said thank God, because I realized that the methodical Germans had at last switched their attacks from my vital aerodromes onto cities. The battle peaks again on September 15th with 2 massive German daylight raids totaling 250 bombers and more than 300 Bf-109s clashing with 300 RAF fighters. The Bf-109s are now in closer escort roles, robbing them of their initiative and making them more vulnerable. The raids cost the Luftwaffe 80 planes, including 23 Bf-109s, for 35 RAF losses. 2 days later, Hitler postpones the invasion of Britain indefinitely. Heavy fighting continues into October, but German bombers transition to safer, less accurate nighttime operations. By October 31st, Dowding considers the Battle of Britain to be over. RAF Fighter Command loses 449 pilots killed and 1,500 aircraft damaged or destroyed. Luftwaffe losses are 2,500 killed and 900 captured, with almost 2,800 aircraft destroyed or damaged. Most German losses are bombers, whose larger crews account for the higher casualty rate. German bombing kills about 23,000 civilians. The Luftwaffe's defeat has multiple causes, including British radar, poor German intelligence, and tactical disadvantages for Luftwaffe pilots, like fighting over enemy territory. It was also fighting a battle for which it was not designed. The Luftwaffe was influenced by interwar theories on strategic bombardment, but financial constraints and the dominance of the army in the German military resulted in an air force geared more towards supporting ground operations with light and dive bombers. These types of bombers lacked the offensive punch to operate unilaterally. Meanwhile, expectations air combat would be similar to naval combat prioritized more expensive turret-equipped heavy fighters. The Germans therefore lacked the capacity to produce enough single-engine fighters, which proved decisive in aerial combat. Historian Jens Wehner concludes. The Luftwaffe flew many inefficient airplanes, like bombers or Zerstörer, into battle. The existing aerial armament advantage in 1940 remained almost inconsequential. To focus on fighter production, Luftwaffe leadership would have to abandon their doctrine. But this was never considered because the German victories of 1939-40 obscured the weakness of the German doctrine. On a strategic level, Luftwaffe commanders and intelligence were poorly prepared for the task at hand. Whereas in combined air-ground operations, it was often sufficient to attack a target close to the front line once, during the Battle of Britain, RAF infrastructure needed to be hit regularly and deliberately. This the Germans did not do, and as a result, the damage caused was often temporary. The RAF, on the other hand, had been developed to counter the threat of strategic bombers and defend British airspace. Neville Chamberlain deserves some credit for this, as he prioritized funding for single-seat fighters like the Spitfire, partly for financial reasons, while others, including Churchill, favored bombers or heavy fighters. The government also funds and supports radar and the sophisticated system which underpinned RAF fighter command operations. Historian John Ray reminds us of the RAF's readiness. If the David and Goliath analogy is accepted, the former was better prepared and the latter less fearsome than customarily believed. It's often said that victory in the battle prevented an invasion of Britain and its likely defeat, but this is disputed. So did Sea Line ever stand a chance? Well, it's impossible to say exactly what would have happened had Britain lost the Battle of Britain. Some historians argue that if the full Sea Line forces had landed in Britain, they could have likely achieved their military objectives, although it remains unclear if Britain would have then surrendered. However, German aerial victory in August and September would not have guaranteed a landing. Firstly, there were only 7 days in those months where the tides were adequate, meaning the Luftwaffe would have to further exhaust itself maintaining air superiority over England until the invasion. With the RAF able to recover in bases beyond Luftwaffe range, that would be difficult. The Royal Navy home fleet also remained a significant threat. With few torpedo bombers, it's unlikely the Luftwaffe would have defeated it from the air. With the Kriegsmarine still recovering from the Norway operation and lacking heavy ships, it was unprepared for battle with the Royal Navy in the Channel. The Royal Navy would have likely swept mine barriers within days, allowing the Royal Navy access to the vulnerable logistical sea routes. They would have lost ships in a risky operation, but stopping or degrading Sea Line would have far outweighed losses. German planning was also deficient. They hoped to transport around 100,000 men in the first 2 waves with about 2,000 canal barges. During 1944's Operation Overlord, though, the Allies needed 4,000 purpose-built landing craft to ship 132,000 men. By that point, the Allies had the benefit of experience from successful and failed amphibious landings in France, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. In 1940, the Germans had no such experience. German inter-service cooperation, vital for amphibious operations, was hampered by rivalries and Hitler's preference for individual instead of group conferences. It's also likely that some commanders doubted Sea Line from the start but didn't want to criticize Hitler's directive, as Vice Admiral Kurt Assmann later claimed. When the time came for the final decision, none of the responsible personalities was ready, despite his knowledge of the weighty matters at stake, to take a firm stand against the operation. All, however, were inwardly relieved to be able to find, in the lack of air mastery, a sound argument which would openly justify them in abandoning the operation. Also, even if Germany could invade, would they have tried? The occupation of Britain, not guaranteed to be short or easy, would be a considerable drain on resources at a time when Hitler was shifting his attention east. From a German perspective, invading Britain was not a necessary prerequisite for invading the Soviet Union, and might even prevent it. By December, Hitler is already making plans against the Soviets, and unlike the cautious phrasing of Directive No. 16, Directive No. 21 is forceful. The German Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign, even before the conclusion of the war against England. For this purpose, the army will have to employ all available units. However, Hitler's change of plans remains secret within the Axis. Throughout late summer, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini still thinks Britain will capitulate. With potential armistice negotiations looming, Italy goes on the offensive to expand its own empire at British expense. Italy conquered a new possession when it invaded Ethiopia in 1935, and Mussolini announced a new Italian East African empire, the Africa Orientale Italiana. Bordering British colonies in the area, Mussolini envisions establishing Kismayo as a gateway to the east, undermining British colonial interests. Mussolini also declares himself defender of Islam to encourage anti-British sentiment amongst African Muslims. Britain worries Italy could launch offensives from East Africa into British colonies, maybe even threaten the Suez Canal from the south. Likewise, it could threaten British oil production across the Red Sea. Italian High Command discusses capturing Khartoum and Atbara, linking up with Graziani's forces in Libya, or striking into French Central African colonies. Another potential target is the refueling base in Chad for British aircraft flying from West Africa to Egypt. However, there is little enthusiasm for such operations in the Italian colonial government in Addis Ababa. The colony's administrator, Duke Amadeo di Savoia-Aosta, has partly modernized Italian East Africa's economy and has developed a reputation as a progressive administrator. Local Ascari troops are generally reliable, but lack equipment, especially anti-tank weapons. The colony is extremely vulnerable to being cut off from the northwest, and Aosta believes it can only withstand 6 months of war. Reluctantly, Aosta proposes a daring strike against British Somaliland. If Italian forces can reach a favorable line before the rainy season, they could wait until Graziani captures Egypt, or there's a diplomatic solution. Aosta has a numerical advantage, with around 75,000 Italian and 205,000 native troops greatly outnumbering neighbouring British garrisons. In August, Italian and Eritrean cavalry break through at Kassala. A follow-up victory at the Tug Argan Gap forces British troops out of Somaliland as the Italians pursue, capturing much-needed supplies. The conquest of British Somaliland boosts Italian morale, but Rome hasn't got an overall strategy and Italian losses are high. The remaining troops are ill-equipped to oppose any kind of British counterattack. Furthermore, the attack forces French colonial administrators to decide their allegiance. Although some, like French West Africa High Commissioner Pierre Boisson, pledged themselves to the Vichy regime, others, like French Chad Lieutenant Governor Félix Iboué, joined the Free French. Vichy and Free French troops now fight each other, and by late August, all French Equatorial Africa has joined the Free French. Now reinforced with Free French troops, Britain plans an attack on Boisson's pro-Vichy forces at Dakar in late September 1940. However, Vichy resistance prevents a landing, and with high casualties likely, the Anglo-French force withdraws. It's a political blow for de Gaulle, and Britain is now reluctant to offer significant help to his forces. In any case, a fresh Italian offensive shifts the focus back to the Mediterranean. Although Mussolini encourages a push into Egypt, he also has imperial ambitions closer to home. In 1939, Italy established a protectorate in Albania. From there, Italy looks to expand into Yugoslavia or Greece to link up with the Italian islands in the Aegean. Rome considers Yugoslavia too pro-German though, so they turn to Greece. Mussolini's foreign minister and son-in-law Galeazzo Ciano urges action. He claims Greek forces are corrupt and inept, Greek civilians are indifferent, and Albanian minorities in Greece will welcome Italians as liberators. But King Vittorio Emanuele, Italian ambassador in Greece Emanuele Grazzi, and Chief of Staff Pietro Badoglio are skeptical. The Greeks are good fighters. They showed it in their last war with Turkey. They were defeated, but they fought valiantly. But Mussolini and Ciano ignore these warnings. Germany is also against an invasion. They need peace in the Balkans to extract war materials, and an Italian attack could encourage British intervention. Britain guaranteed Greek neutrality in April 1939, and the presence of British aircraft in Greece could threaten Romanian oil fields. Germany accepts that Greece is in Italy's sphere of influence, but wants any invasion delayed until after Britain's defeat. Mussolini agrees. After the German Luftwaffe moves into Romania to protect the oil fields, though, an outraged Mussolini accelerates plans to invade despite his promises. Hitler always faces me with a fait accompli. This time, I am going to pay him back in his own coin. He will find out from the papers that I have occupied Greece. In this way, the equilibrium will be re-established. Italian plans grow from a partial to a complete occupation of Greece. But Italian planning is rushed and complicated by mass demobilization for the harvest, unenthusiastic officers, and a lack of suitable Albanian ports. The only usable port for troops, Durazzo, is already clogged with barges carrying marble for fascist building projects. As a result, not all troops have their heavy weapons. Mussolini hopes Bulgaria will join in the attack, but the Bulgarian king refuses. By late October, around 6 Italian divisions, including the crack Giulia Alpini division, are moving towards the Greek-Albanian border. The 87,000 Italian troops expect to oppose around 30,000 Greeks, despite intelligence suggesting 10 times as many may be available. Italy's aggressive rhetoric and poor operational security means Greek dictator Ioannis Metaxas is aware of Italian intentions. He hopes for an orderly withdrawal as far as Mount Othris, although some commanders prefer a more aggressive plan. Luckily for the Greeks, the border's mountainous terrain limits Italian invasion routes. Mussolini starts the invasion on October 28th, the date of Hitler's planned visit to Florence. He plans to surprise his ally with news of imminent victory. At 3 a.m. after staging border incidents, Ambassador Grazzi issues Metaxas an ultimatum: allow Italy to occupy key strategic locations in Greece or face war. Metaxas responds in diplomatic French: Alors, c'est la guerre. Well then, it's war. His response is later popularized as an emphatic ochi, or no. In reality, Italian troops like Lieutenant Genserico Fontana are moving before the ultimatum was delivered. The night is dark and rainy. Tomorrow, we may hope that Mars will favor us. Even though we are few, we have no fear. We have our hand grenades in our pockets, and they don't weigh much. Here comes the dawn, dismal and soundless. In the opening attack, the Ferrara, Siena and Centauro divisions with 163 light tanks push into the Kalamas River Valley towards Ioannina, while the Giulia division attacks in the center around Mount Smolikas. A smaller force pushes along the coast. Although the Greeks expected Italian aggression, the rank and file are still shocked when it actually comes. We woke up around 6:30. We heard thunder from the west. Its brightness was mirrored on the clouds. A rumor was spread that war was declared between Greece and Italy. It was a shock. Nobody expected this news. Our hearts froze. Initial Greek resistance is light, but rain slows down the Italians. Greek 8th Division Commander General Katsimitros decides to make a stand at Kalpaki, where the Italians have to cross a plain. From November 2nd, Italian columns enter the area and come under artillery fire from well-concealed positions. The Greeks lack anti-tank weapons, but their artillery scatters the Italian tanks, while infantry improvise by throwing blankets onto light tanks' tracks to immobilize them. As the Italians attempt to push through the plain, fighting centers on Krampala Hill, which changes hands several times. As the weather clears, Italian aircraft bomb Greek positions. An airplane bomb whistled over me and fell into the forest, 20 meters below my tent. A fellow soldier shouted for his foot and called for help. I approached the bomb crater, a body drowned in blood without skull or brains. Beside him, a corporal was still alive, with an open wound in his back and his intestines poured out. He died in my arms. My heart was completely broken from the horror. While the Italians struggle at Kalpaki, the Julia division hits Greek positions in the Pindus Mountains. They make early progress against Greek reservists, but sporadic Greek sniping and poor weather exhaust and disorganize the attackers. After Greek reinforcements stall the Italian advance on November 2nd, the Greeks counterattack, capturing Samarina and threatening to cut off the Italians. By November 8th, the Greeks capture Distrato, forcing the Julia to withdraw. In 2 weeks of fighting, the Julia division loses a fifth of its strength. The Greek army now moves over to the offensive, even invading Albania in the north. A frustrated Mussolini orders his air force to bomb all Greek towns of over 10,000 people. The Italian air force has already bombed Athens and other towns with little effect, which denies frontline Italian forces desperately needed air support. In Rome, there's tension and even talks of truce. Reluctant Italian ministers even consider asking for German help. Hitler is furious when informed about the invasion during the meeting in Florence, as his adjutant recalls. Führer, in a rage, observed that this occurrence had spoiled many plans he had in mind, and doubted if the Italians would be able to defeat Greece. The Greek debacle is only the start of bad news for Mussolini. By late fall, Hitler cancels the invasion of Britain as well as a short-lived Mediterranean initiative. He tries to get Spanish dictator Francisco Franco into the war and draws up plans to seize Gibraltar and get Vichy France on the German side for good. But Mussolini's blunder and the overlapping claims of Spain, France, and Italy in the region put an end to all that. Hitler now focuses on the invasion of the Soviet Union, which makes Churchill confident that Britain can look for fresh opportunities against Italy. By 1940, the Italian Navy is the fifth largest in the world and could menace British imperial connections around the Suez Canal. However, by late 1940, the Italian Supermarina has done little. A first clash with British ships at Calabria in July ended indecisively, but illustrated Italian naval limitations. German observer and intelligence chief Admiral Wilhelm Canaris blames the Italian command structure. The Italian Navy has, for the most part, excellent qualities, which should enable it to stand up to the best navies in the world. It is too bad that its high command lacks decision-making. But this probably is because it has to work under the disordered directives of the Italian Supreme Command. The Navy High Command is especially conservative and royalist. Few officers support Mussolini, and they support top-down military decision-making. Cooperation between military branches is poor, and the Navy only learns of the Greece invasion 12 days before it starts. The Italian fleet mostly remains docked at Taranto, well protected by coastal gun batteries. Classic seaborne attack on Taranto seems impossible, but this is not what Britain intends. Instead, the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious leads a purely airborne attack against the Italian fleet. Carrier operations are in their infancy in 1940 and they're largely unproven. Initially, carriers are expected to provide air cover for fleets at sea, not to attack independently. British carrier-based Swordfish torpedo bombers are slow, flimsy, and outdated, but they're versatile and reliable, and the Italians do not expect such an attack. Although Italian ships set up anti-torpedo nets, the British developed new duplex piston torpedoes which pass under the nets and detonate via a ship's magnetic field. On the night of November 11th, 12th, Operation Judgment begins. 24 Swordfish head for Taranto, using flares to locate targets. They drop torpedoes into the tightly packed ships, striking Litorioa and Duilo. Conte di Cavour is beached after a hit, several other ships are damaged, and shore facilities set ablaze. The British achieve complete surprise, and in a single night neutralize half the Supermarina. Italian commander Marcantonio Bragadin complains. Bulletin followed bulletin. It seemed that a great naval battle had been fought, and no one yet knew if and when it would be possible to recover from the grave consequences of it. Although much of the damage at Taranto can be repaired, the Italian fleet is paralyzed for the foreseeable future. Italian Naval Command disperses their fleet, further reducing effectiveness just when Italian ground forces need resupply. For Graziani in Egypt, time has already run out. By December, UK invasion fears have eased, and more British and Commonwealth troops and equipment arrive in Alexandria, including Matilda tanks and Hurricane fighters. Western Desert Force Commander Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor realizes the role mechanized forces and surprise can play in a desert environment. The Matilda, considered invulnerable to most Italian weapons, plays a major role in the upcoming Operation Compass. In early December, British-led forces, including many Indian troops, gather in the Egyptian desert. British naval bombardment and air attack destroy Italian aircraft and divert attention from the buildup. The Italians partially detect it, but aren't worried. Early on December 9th, British forces rush Nibewa through poorly laid Italian minefields. The 23 Italian M11 tanks are outmatched and surprised, and Matildas quickly destroy 13. An Italian doctor describes the scene. "It was the nearest thing to hell I ever saw." Italian troops with no anti-tank weapons resort to tossing grenades onto British tanks, but despite fierce resistance, it's a one-sided battle. The British capture 4,000 Italians and suffer just 2 killed and 5 wounded. After securing Nibewa, the British assault the camp at Tumar West and defeat a counterattack from Tumar East. Meanwhile, the 4th Armoured Brigade moves to cut the Sidi Barrani to Bardia Road. The next day, the assault continues, although severe sandstorms and accurate Italian artillery delay Selby force in the east. In some cases, British columns simply follow a compass bearing through the storms towards their target. The British capture Mactila with the aid of naval gunfire, but Italian resistance at Sidi Barrani is fierce, forcing Selby force to temporarily withdraw. Italian morale, though, is crashing. Tumar East and Point 90 surrender, and as artillery, air power and Matildas concentrate on Sidi Barrani, it too surrenders. British mobile forces race west to capture fleeing Italians. A British soldier reports to his regimental headquarters about the mass of prisoners. "Have arrived at the 2nd B in Book. As far as I can see, there are 20 acres of officers and 100 acres of men." In the first 3 days, the British capture 38,000 Italian troops, 237 guns, and 73 tanks. But the Italians are not completely defeated, and they fall back to new positions further west. The defeat in North Africa also signals the end of Italian success in East Africa. With morale plummeting, Aosta faces a strong British response. As the rainy season ends in December 1940, the British reinforce their units in East Africa, including with Indians and South Africans re-equipped with modern weapons, communication equipment, motorized and mechanized support, and air power. With this force, General Sir Archibald Wavell is determined to restore British prestige in the area. Britain also pledges to return Ethiopian King Haile Selassie to his throne, hoping to incite an anti-Italian uprising. As modern British and South African fighters outclass Italian aircraft, Aosta disperses his force to reinforce strongholds, giving Britain free rein in the countryside. By early 1941, the Italians abandon Mogadishu as casualties reach 30,000. And so it seems Britain has successfully contained Italian expansion and secured vital connections to its wider empire. But access to the Mediterranean is only one element of British survival. In the summer of 1940, Great Britain is under attack in the air and at sea. German U-boat wolf packs prowl the Atlantic and sink over 1 million tons of shipping. German skippers call this the happy time. But was the German Navy actually that successful early in the Battle of the Atlantic? By early 1940, Germany can point to some notable naval successes, such as Günther Prien's October 1939 raid. But these headline-grabbing operations do not fundamentally weaken the Royal Navy and do not prevent supplies reaching British docks. The Kriegsmarine also discovers a major flaw with their U-boats. Since September 1939, U-boat captains report malfunctions of the G7A and G7E torpedoes, both when armed for contact and magnetic demolition. Torpedoes often explode too early, or not at all, or they miss their targets. Whereas lone merchantmen can be attacked with deck guns, sinking escorted ships or warships requires torpedoes. In early 1940, Durrett estimates 330,000 tons of Allied shipping have been saved by malfunctioning torpedoes, including the carrier Ark Royal and battleship Warspite. Prien complains, "I cannot be expected again to fight with a wooden gun." The Germans investigate and develop new designs from captured British models. Torpedo performance improves, although issues remain until 1942. Despite this, U-boats are gaining momentum. The Norwegian operation, although successful, sees heavy losses in the surface fleet, shifting attention to the U-boats. More subs are also launched, including larger Type 7s. Furthermore, it's clear the war will not be over quickly, making Dönnitz's U-boat-centric economic warfare strategy more attractive to Hitler. The fall of France in 1940 provides more opportunities. Bases on the French Atlantic coast allow U-boats to operate 640 kilometers further into the Atlantic, where they can now threaten unescorted convoys in the mid-Atlantic Gap, an area beyond the endurance of escorts from Canada or the UK. German command removes restrictions on targeting neutral shipping so they can attack any ship in the designated war zones except Italian, Japanese, Soviet, Spanish, or Irish vessels. The US bars their vessels from entering such regions. As U-boat operations increase, Britain recalls escorts for anti-invasion duties, leaving too few for transatlantic convoys. To compensate, Canada rapidly expands the Royal Canadian Navy from 3,600 personnel to 10,000 by September 1940 and starts a native shipbuilding program specializing in merchantmen, destroyers, and corvettes. But with less experience and a smaller economic base, such breakneck expansion will take time to have an impact. So despite a rough start to 1940, U-boats see more success from June. In fact, captains soon dubbed the period die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Overall, Dönitz is still short on U-boats for immediate combat. Extensive operations mean roughly half are not available. He also has lost 25 by July 1940. However, he observes that British convoy escort tactics rely on their underwater sonar system known as ASDIC. By attacking on the surface at night, groups of U-boats can use their greater speed and visibility to confuse escorts and target merchantmen. Dönitz developed this so-called Rudeltaktik before the war, but was reluctant to employ it when British escorts were numerous. Now, with many escorts in British waters or under repair, he has an opportunity. Also known as Wolfpack tactics, the new approach is part of a tonnage war strategy to sink enough merchant shipping to force British capitulation, or at the very least, massively degrade its military potential. While Dönitz commands from his new headquarters at Lorient, he receives intelligence from the Navy's Beobachtungsdienst, which has access to British convoy naval ciphers. Using this information, he concentrates his most experienced captains for group attacks on known convoy routes. In June, 3 HX convoys from Halifax lose 7 ships, while in late August, U-boats, in a rare coordination with aircraft, sink 8 ships in convoy HX-65. On September 20th, 7 U-boats sink 11 ships in convoy HX-72. Several U-boat commanders, including Prien and Schulze, become aces, a title awarded for sinking 50,000 tons of shipping. The number of merchantman sinkings in the North Atlantic also increases drastically from previous months. On October 16, 1940, several aces rendezvous for an attack on SC-7, a slow convoy from Sydney, Nova Scotia, with 35 merchantmen and 5 escorts. One escort is lost when it breaks off to pursue U-48 and fails to rejoin the convoy. Then, on the night of October 17th, SC-7 passes through a patrol line of 5 U-boats. They sink 20 ships, 7 by ace Otto Kretschmer's U-99. He describes an attack on SS Fiscus. 2355. Fire a torpedo at a large freighter of some 6,000 tons, at a range of 750 meters. Hit abreast foremast. Immediately after torpedo explosion, there is another explosion with a high column of flame from the bow to the bridge. The smoke rises some 200 meters. Bow apparently shattered. Ship continues to burn with a green flame. Shortly afterwards, Prien leads another attack on convoy HX-79 and sinks 12 more. Surface ships also add to the tally, with pocket battleship Admiral Scheer sinking 6 ships from convoy HX-84. In all the attacks, British escorts perform poorly. They have no reliable means of intership communication, few have surface radar, and escorts abandon convoys to chase U-boats or pick up survivors. By December 1940, Germany has sunk 4.3 million tons of Allied shipping since September 1939, roughly 55% of it by U-boats. Monthly losses are often double or triple the replacement rate of new shipping. Britain compensates for the heavy losses by tighter rationing, cutting imports, building more escorts, and looking for help from elsewhere. In 1939 and 1940, US assistance to Britain and France is limited by the US neutrality laws, anti-war public opinion, and the anti-interventionist America First movement. The US forbids any military operations in an established neutrality zone, roughly alongside Hitler's specified zones in which neutral shipping might be attacked. Hitler wants to keep the US out of the war, at least for now. He and others recall the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which contributed to US entry in the First World War, so he orders naval commanders to stay away from American ships. The Naval High Command is to wage the war at sea in such a manner that incidents with the United States are avoided under all circumstances. But German leaders are frustrated with the US's support for Britain. Some US figures publicly celebrate the Royal Navy's sinking of the Graf Spee, despite it taking place in the US's neutrality zone. In some cases, German captains let a sure kill pass rather than risk the danger of sinking a misidentified US ship. President Roosevelt is also supportive of British requests for armaments. Neutrality laws bar him from selling or transporting them, but Roosevelt claims they do not prevent him from bartering them. The result is the September 1940 Destroyers for Bases deal, in which Britain cedes sovereign rights to bases in the Caribbean, Newfoundland, and South America in exchange for 50 older US destroyers. Not everyone in the UK, including Winston Churchill, is enthusiastic about the destroyers, which have been poorly maintained and require overhaul. By May 1941, only 30 are in operation, but the deal is a shift in US policy. Roosevelt, fresh from electoral success in November, steps up cooperation, announcing a Lend-Lease program in December. This allows the US to sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of any US property to a state the president deems vital to US security. Equipment must be paid for and transported on foreign ships, but the details are deliberately vague, and Britain can defer payment. Soon afterwards, in January 1941, Anglo-American cooperation deepens with the secret America-Britain-Canada I talks in Washington. The talks are designed to coordinate joint action if the US joins the war, and lay the groundwork of a Germany First strategy and cooperation in transatlantic defense, convoys, and intelligence sharing. With the threat of invasion largely over by early 1941, Churchill identifies the Atlantic as the vital theater of operations. After Hitler threatens a massive escalation in U-boat operations, Churchill responds. In February, as you remember, that bad man in one of his raving outbursts threatened us with a terrifying increase in the numbers and activities of his U-boats and in his attacks. That is what is called the Battle of the Atlantic, which, in order to survive, we have got to win on salt water just as decisively as we had to win the Battle of Britain last August and September in the air. So the U-boats are on the offensive and appear to be taking a toll, but Britain's Royal Navy is still strong, and the UK can concentrate on the Atlantic. So just how successful were the U-boats in 1940? Throughout the 4-month happy time in mid-1940, German U-boats sink around 1.1 million tons of Allied shipping. This is a significant increase over the first months of the year, but it's not decisive. Most sinkings are still independently sailing ships, and convoy attacks remain comparatively rare. After the SC-7 battle, only 9 of the next 55 slow convoys suffer any losses at all. Durrett estimates U-boats need to sink at least 300,000 tons a month to degrade Britain's massive merchant fleet, which now includes ships from German-occupied territories, and to counteract replacements. U-boats only achieved this goal in 2 months in 1940. Before the war, the Kriegsmarine struggled for influence within a German military hierarchy dominated by the army and the Luftwaffe, which were seen as more essential to Hitler's continental goals. Meanwhile, influential Nazis hoped that Britain would remain neutral in a European war. The navy was further internally divided between Rohde, who favored a balanced fleet, and Durrett, who favored submarines and an attritional strategy. Both approaches required long-term planning and time for construction, which contradicted Hitler's preference for short-term opportunism and bold action. Even after Berlin approved Plan Z in 1939, the Navy struggled to get the resources allotted to it, and Rohde was pessimistic. As far as the Navy is concerned, obviously it is in no way very adequately equipped for the great struggle with Great Britain. The submarine arm is much too weak. The surface forces, moreover, are so inferior in number and strength to those of the British fleet that, even at full strength, they can do no more than show that they know how to die gallantly. As a result, when war did break out in 1939, 9 years earlier than Plan Z's expected completion date, the Kriegsmarine was ill prepared for either Rohde's or Dönnitz's preferred strategies. There were not enough surface ships to challenge the Royal Navy in open battle, and although ships like the Graf Spee grabbed headlines with their surface raids, the amount of merchant tonnage sunk was low considering their construction time, crew size, maintenance requirements, and fuel consumption. U-boats are much more efficient and cost-effective merchant raiders, but pre-war prioritization of larger ships means there are not enough subs in 1940. But it's important to note that Dönitz knows this and was encouraged by the damage caused by only a handful of U-boats. During the happy times, only an average of about 6 U-boats were immediately available to attack a given convoy. If Dönitz had 300 operational U-boats, most of the larger design, he anticipates far surpassing the success of the happy times. But time is working against Germany. According to Vice Admiral Kurt Assmann, after the war, Dönitz believed he had roughly 2 years before the Allies would advance in technology and ships to effectively counter the U-boats. This placed additional time pressure on shipbuilding, sea trials, and training. And Britain does not sit idle. In late 1940, the Royal Navy creates 8 specially trained escort groups with better anti-submarine weapons, VHF radios between ships, more coastal command aircraft, and new technologies. But U-boats are just one of their concerns, since at least 2 of Plan Z's ambitious designs will soon take to the seas. They are the largest warships Germany has ever built, the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. 1939 and 1940 are not just momentous years for those fighting, but also for the millions who now find themselves under foreign occupation. In Poland, German authorities deport Poles from annexed areas into the general government, an administrative region the Germans create. German officials also give Polish property to ethnic Germans and continue to kill Polish elites. Between September 1939 and January 1940, Operation Tannenberg sees Einsatzgruppen execution squads kill up to 20,000 leading Poles. By late 1940, the figure could be as high as 200,000, although this is disputed. German administrators send arrested Poles to new labor camps and concentration camps like Sachsenhausen near Berlin and the newly built camp at Auschwitz. Nazi authorities confiscate Jewish Poles' property and concentrate Jews into ghettos from October 1939, though historians debate to what extent central planning versus local bureaucratic initiative play a role in the decision. Initially a temporary measure to facilitate deportation, ghetto conditions quickly deteriorate. This deterioration is due both to mismanagement and deliberate policy. In Łódź, for example, German administrators starve Jews they think have hidden their wealth. The creation of the ghettos leads to debate amongst German administrators whose rival bureaucratic entities vie for control. Some recognize a manpower potential in ghettos, while others see a means for extermination. Alexander Palfinger, deputy chief of ghetto administration in Łódź, clashes with his superior. A rapid dying out of the Jews is for us a matter of total indifference, if not to say desirable, as long as the concomitant effects leave the public interest of the German people untouched. There is also tension between some army commanders and the SS and civilian Reich administration. General Johannes Blaskowitz complains about Einsatzgruppen operations in Poland, especially their impact on his army troops. So far, the police has made no visible contribution to security and has instead spread terror amongst the population. How the police can justify forcing their own ranks into this bloodlust, I cannot judge, but it is certain that it is an unacceptable burden for the army that all this occurs in field grey uniforms. The current situation is leading to the development of unrest and is preventing the exploitation of the country to the benefit of the army and the war economy. Blaskowitz likely doesn't know that the operations have Hitler's blessing, who denounces his complaints as childish. Blaskowitz is an exception in the Wehrmacht, which provides direct and indirect support for the Einsatzgruppen. For non-Jews like writer Zofia Naukowska, the occupation also brings food shortages, unemployment, and fear. No one predicted such a reality in the most fanciful dreams. Everyone's living in a nightmare, wishing to wake up. Unbelievable bleakness and poverty of life, ignorance of one's own fate, of other people's fates, gruesome stories from everywhere. In the east, the Soviet Union also annexes occupied regions after rigged elections in November 1939. Soviet NKVD's secret police units also target Polish leaders, especially army officers, clergymen, business owners, and nobles. Most notably, they killed 22,000 Polish officers at Katyn in spring 1940. Throughout the war, Soviet authorities also conduct mass deportations, first Polish POWs and officials, then the families of those arrested, and those who had fled to the Soviet zone to escape the Germans. In total, the Soviets transport roughly 1 million Poles east, where many die in harsh labor camps. At first, resistance to both occupations is minimal. Some residents of Poland, including many Ukrainian and Belarusian peasants and some left-wing Jewish intellectuals, welcome the arrival of Soviet troops as a relief from what they see as Polish oppression. But the stereotype of mass Jewish collaboration with Soviet authorities is not historically corroborated, and many residents of all ethnicities and religions in Poland will soon turn against their occupiers. In occupied Western Europe, the Nazi occupation is much different than in Poland, though the Germans imposed curfews, rationing, and censorship. The Nazis considered Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands to be racially Aryan, so conditions there are relatively lenient. Although the Dutch and Norwegian governments in exile call for resistance, many remaining civil servants cooperate with German authorities to preserve law and order and economic well-being. Germany also wants to avoid a heavy-handed occupation to keep up productivity and better extract resources. Although collaboration is strongest among ideologically Nazi or anti-parliamentary organizations, historian Gerhard Hirschfeld concludes that one must note the context of 1940. The military victories of the German Wehrmacht had an enormously strong psychological impact on the people in the occupied countries of Western Europe. A deep feeling of helplessness resulted from the conviction that the Germans had achieved a final and total victory, and, on a rather more individual level, that the thing to do now was to draw the necessary political conclusions by recognizing this fait accompli. France experiences a unique occupation. Hitler wants to quickly negotiate France's surrender in June 1940 and allows France to keep its fleet and empire. Most importantly, the Germans only occupy 60% of France at first, with the rest under the Vichy regime of Marshal Philippe Pétain. Pétain believes collaboration can maintain French sovereignty and suppress the political left. In late October, he announces a révolution nationale to create a new, supposedly apolitical government of national unity. His regime becomes increasingly authoritarian and blames France's defeat on its democratic parliamentary politics. La défaite est venue de nos relâchements. The defeat came from our lapses. Pétain argues collaboration, which he calls the shield, protects France from the worst case of full-on German occupation, and many French see his actions as patriotic and a necessary evil. Under the shield, French police are responsible for implementing policies against the Jews. Berlin directs occupied nations to enact German-style anti-Semitic laws, although results vary. Local police enact new policies slowly, while the Wehrmacht wants to prevent SS intrusion into military occupations. Even so, persecution increases from fall 1940. Non-Jewish French also suffer. German authorities displace 150,000 residents of the former German regions of Alsace and Lorraine, and keep 900,000 French soldiers in prisoner camps, angering their families. Even so, resistance is minor at first, consisting of leaflets, underground publishing, or student protests. Leftist groups take the lead, but are ideologically divided, especially regarding the Nazi-Soviet pact and the Mers el-Kebir attack. So in 1940, the occupation in the West is partly indirect, but this will soon change. Protests will increase in 1941, and as German war demands grow, so too will the harshness of its occupation. 1940 is a momentous year for Europe and the rest of the world. France is defeated and Britain rallies its empire to continue the fight. Meanwhile, Italy is humiliated and struggles in Greece and Africa. But how good or bad is 1940 for the other warring states? There's no doubt that by the end of 1940, Italy had suffered a series of military disasters. So why did Italian forces do so badly? After the war, some historians emphasized the poor quality of Italian troops, low morale, a lack of equipment, and Mussolini's personality. They claim Mussolini rushed into a war for imperialistic reasons without adequate preparation and relied on optimistic propaganda as opposed to realistic military assessments. Only 19 of Italy's 73 divisions were ready in 1940, and its smaller economic base hindered mobilization. Italy accounted for only 2.7% of world manufacturing output, compared to Britain's 9.2% and Germany's 10.7%. Observers also blame Italian equipment. Italy relied heavily on obsolete World War I weaponry to equip its troops. This is partially true of all militaries at the time, but Italy's lower industrial base prevented rapid development of new equipment or mass production of higher quality weaponry like the 90mm anti-aircraft gun or Beretta Model 1938 submachine gun. A reliance on older equipment meant Italian officers fell back on older methods of warfare, especially colonial policing. When modern equipment was available, they sent it first to police units as opposed to front-line combatants. As a result, Italian troops lacked automatic weapons, vehicles, radios, and anti-tank weaponry, as well as the tactical and technical skills for their use. Most of the Italian rank and file were peasants, and class differences, poor conditions, and harsh discipline created clashes with conservative officers. One conscript, mobilized in June 1940, referenced rebellions by Italian troops back in 1917. All the officers have become like beasts, and they issue punishments fit to break your neck. But once we're on the move, they'll pay for it. We'll do like they did in the last war. But a lack of equipment was only part of the problem. In Greece, Italian troops were similarly equipped to Greek troops. The failed invasion of Greece is therefore more a result of poor terrain, planning, and logistics. Internal Italian planning was dysfunctional. All important naval logistical routes were badly prepared, and the Italian Navy learned about the planned invasion less than 2 weeks in advance. The Italians had accurate information on Greek troop numbers, which far exceeded Ciano's optimistic assessment, but the High Command ignored it. As a result, Italian troops struggled to even achieve numerical parity with Greek defenders. They also relied too much on hopeful outcomes that they couldn't control, like Bulgarian assistance and a pro-Italian uprising in Greece. Some historians also argue that Mussolini's fervent, long-standing desire for an expanded Italian empire is the cause of all these failures. But another view places the blame partly elsewhere. There is an argument that Germany plays a more significant role in Italian failures than previously thought, and although Mussolini may have roused Italian patriotism with talk of empire, he knew Italy was unprepared for war. Unpreparedness was not a uniquely Italian problem either. Although only 24% of Italian divisions were ready in 1940, just 34% of German divisions were similarly prepared in September 1939. Mussolini may have been a much less enthusiastic participant in the so-called Pact of Steel with Germany than commonly believed. Historian James Sadkovich suggests Mussolini joined the Axis partly to restrain Hitler's expansionism and even considered breaking the alliance in December 1939. In any case, there was little practical cooperation, and both sides kept their plans from the other. Sadkovich also argues Mussolini's decision to join the war was more about avoiding punishment by a dominant Germany for past transgressions than imperial goals. Until mid-1940, Mussolini's imperial dream was mostly limited to the Balkan coast and weaker African nations. But Mussolini had encouraged Austria to resist the Anschluss in 1938 and failed to join the war in 1939, both of which frustrated Hitler. Unexpected German victories, including a seemingly imminent one against Britain, might have encouraged Mussolini to make more maximalist imperial claims and act prematurely, not necessarily just because of Allied weakness, but due to concerns that Germany would capitalize on its position to expand into Italy's sphere of influence in the Balkans. In this circumstance, Italian actions in Egypt can be seen as securing the Greek front, as opposed to outright imperial conquest. It's claimed Mussolini hoped to fight a so-called guerra paralela, a parallel war, to the wider Second World War. However, doing so inevitably brought Italy into conflict with Britain, which was fighting a total war. In this circumstance, Italy became overextended across the Mediterranean, which was only of secondary importance to its German ally, but of vital importance to Britain. Still, Italy overstretched itself based on the assumption Germany would soon invade Britain. The distrust, suspicion, and lack of communication between the Axis, however, meant Mussolini didn't know about Germany's lack of will and capability to launch that invasion, or Germany's shift to prioritizing an invasion of the Soviet Union. Italy therefore became embroiled in a long, multi-front war that its smaller economy simply could not maintain. According to Sadkovich, it was the disparity in equipment and motorization between the British and Italian troops, not inherent low morale or fighting ability of Italian troops, which caused the mass surrenders during Kempf. Italian troops simply could not withdraw on foot across the desert. And British accounts do speak of fierce Italian resistance during the battle. Sadkovich concludes that Anglo-American historians are influenced by stereotypes in their writing about Italian fighting ability, and suggests Italian troops are unfairly compared to German troops, who had the benefit of better equipment and better leadership. Some historians may also exaggerate German abilities to excuse Allied failings or aggrandize their own eventual victory. It is thus normal to dismiss as loss of nerve Graziani's request for permission to retreat in late 1940, even though a rapid retreat seems to have been what was needed. At the same time, Anglo-American writers tend to depict Rommel's various retreats as evidence of military genius. While accepting weak Italian industrialization and command did play an issue, this line of reasoning also highlights Germany's failure to force Britain into an all-out defense of the British Isles. This allowed Britain to invest significant resources into North Africa, turning it into a wider war than Italy could or even wanted to fight. It might have been German management of the wider war and pursuit of their own interest in the Balkans, rather than Italian inherent weakness or expansionism, that laid the foundations for Italian failure in 1940. But of course, this is still up for debate. That Italy did experience disaster after disaster is not debatable, and in fall 1940, Italy reluctantly seeks German help. Germany, which has paid little attention to Italian capabilities or needs, agrees to shore up a seemingly unreliable ally. As one Wehrmacht commander put it, help was unwillingly given and unwillingly accepted. On the surface, 1939 and 1940 appear as monumentally positive for Germany. It's now the most powerful military and political force in continental Europe and has gained access to the industrial and manpower potential of occupied states. Its invasion of France, which some German generals viewed with skepticism, solidifies a popular image of an undefeatable Germany, which is reinforced by the Norwegian operation. Still, the war has not been won and Britain remains in the fight. Despite the decisive moves in 1939 and early 1940, late 1940 sees a German strategic crisis. Different branches of the Wehrmacht push different objectives, be it a sea-borne invasion of Britain, submarine warfare, allying with Spain and capturing Gibraltar, or aerial bombardment. None of these options fit into traditional German strategic thinking, which focuses on land operations. German victories also intensify internal military rivalries and Hitler's opinion of his own supposed genius. General Erich von Manstein, who later blames Hitler for Germany's defeat, will write after the war. When the head of state or a war machine has to ask himself what next after his military operations have entirely fulfilled, or as in this case, far exceeded his expectations, one cannot help wondering whether such a thing as a war plan ever existed on the German side. In January 1941, though, Manstein adopts a different tone in letters to his wife Jutta. The Führer's speech yesterday was nothing new despite its length. The most remarkable thing was the hidden threat against Russia that we're ready for any eventuality, or even more, the warning to England that it cannot pin its hopes on the Russian card. And so, by December 1940, Britain can point to several successes despite a disastrous summer. It prevented an invasion of the home islands and has taken offensive action against the Italians. Germany does little to interrupt Britain's strategy of imperial warfare, diplomatically or militarily, and cannot challenge British influence further afield. In fact, now that it's been drawn into an attritional conflict with the British Empire, it's arguably on the road to defeat, as historian John Darwin concludes. The intimidating scale of the British Empire's territorial extent, including its self-governing member states and colonial possessions, made it hard to imagine the ultimate defeat of such a global leviathan. Still, Britain is not winning the war in late 1940. Although the Italians continue to struggle everywhere, Germany dominates the continent in an unassailable position and is stepping up U-boat operations in the Atlantic. British operations against the Italians on the edge of the European theatre are partially to secure routes to the wider empire, but also because Britain has few other options. Furthermore, although much of the Commonwealth rallies to Britain, troop contributions come with conditions as they want to avoid the carnage of World War I. Even with Commonwealth support, Britain lacks the forces to return to Europe. Although they may fight under British commanders, the Dominions want their forces to retain their national identities. Their leaders pressure Churchill to publicly acknowledge the contributions are freely given by sovereign nations, not mere colonial levies. Throughout the war, several dominions, like Australia, used the war as a basis to renegotiate their relationship with Britain. Meanwhile, for Indian nationalists, war contributions provide political opportunities. Gandhi first calls for full Indian independence on June 29, 1940, followed by a campaign of civil disobedience which leads to hundreds of arrests, including, eventually, his own. Although Britain can suppress any major opposition for now, Indian nationalists recognize Britain cannot simply return to business as usual after the war. The British Empire will go to pieces, and not all the king's horses and all the king's men will be able to put it together again. And so, by mobilizing its empire in yet another war, Britain may also be ushering in its end. Ultimately, Hitler decides not to decide on how to defeat Britain in 1940. Despite previously acknowledging the dangers of a two-front war, he directs his generals towards the one campaign that they can reasonably plan and execute: the invasion of the Soviet Union. As Europe was in the grip of the Axis powers in 1940 and Japan was still fighting China on the other side of the globe, it looked like Germany, Italy, and Japan might be able to achieve their goals against the old imperial powers. But why did the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, unleash the cataclysm of the Second World War? If you want to learn more about the origins of this global conflict, you can check out the new World War II series by our good friends over at Epic History TV. The first video covers the early 1930s with Hitler's rise to power, Japan's invasion of China, and Mussolini's imperial ambitions in Africa. And where can you watch Epic History TV's World War II series right now, months before it's available on YouTube? On Nebula, a creator-owned streaming service that features not only us, but also Epic History TV and many more talented creators. Nebula is made and curated by humans. It's available in 4K resolution in your browser, on your smartphone, smart TV, or streaming box like Apple TV or Roku. And that's not all. On Nebula, you can also watch all our regular videos ad-free and earlier than on YouTube. And all that for just $36 for an entire year if you go to nebula.tv/realtimehistory. Right now, you can also get the Nebula Lifetime membership. Pay once and get access to everything Nebula has to offer for as long as you and Nebula exist. If you go to nebula.tv/realtimehistory, you can save $200 off of the usual price. The lifetime membership allows us to invest in more original content and improve the platform for everyone. 1/3 of your lifetime membership will also support us at Real Time History directly. Nebula is also a great gift, by the way. Just go to gift.nebula.tv/realtimehistory to give an entire year to family and friends, even if they already have an account. Whether you watch Nebula on your own or give it to someone else, you're supporting us here at Real Time History directly. We want to thank Filip Czaska, Sofia Shirogorova, Roman Töppel, Christoph Bergs, Markus Linke, Athanasio Valantis, and Dr. Vanda Wilcox for their help with this episode. If you want to watch another extended overview of a crucial war year in the Second World War, check out our video on the entirety of 1943 in Europe. For a selection of sources used for this documentary, check the video description below. If you're watching this on Nebula or Patreon, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that wonders if our 1940 video is 3.5 hours long, how long is our 1944 video going to be?